Hello everybody, and it's Drydock episode 312, part 2. There's still plenty of questions to go, so let's just get straight on with them, shall we? Graham William Kidd asks, very simple question, what's the worst - dumbest take on matters naval that you've ever heard, read or seen? Well, I'm going to take a slightly rare dive and come to the present day because, well, let's just say at least in the time period the channel covers, journalists covering naval matters generally had at least a smidgen of a grasp on reality. Yes, they invented the term pocket battleship, but when you look at a Deutschland class carrying 11-inch guns and you've got the, well, later on the Scharnhorsts round and the pre-dreadnoughts that Germany still had hanging around at that point, you can kind of, if you squint and look sideways at it, see why they might try and drum up a bit of scare tactics by saying, oh look, it's like it's a little mini battleship. There is a certain method to the madness. And then you fast forward to the modern day, and yeah, did these people actually go to school? And if they did they actually graduate, or did someone just let them out a side gate because they were fed up dealing with them? This is obviously the classic. This is the Daily Star, a UK newspaper, being extremely strident, although they did later update the article once it was pointed out how utterly dumb they were, complaining that the Royal Navy had splashed out £183 million on a 5-inch gun, and they literally thought they meant a gun that was 5 inches long, as you can see at the bottom, thinking it's the length of a toothbrush. They didn't actually stop to think that maybe the Navy wasn't going to spend £183 million on something that's smaller than the average sidearm of the Royal Marines. Is in fact a 5-inch caliber gun, the deck gun, considerably larger than your average toothbrush. Although maybe if you work in a zoo with elephants, perhaps not. And this isn't exactly the only isolated example. Back when the Second Gulf War kicked off, there was a headline splash about, I believe it was the Royal Marines, destroying Iraqi battleships. And then when you read into the text, it's the little fast attack craft, and in some cases rigid inflatables, that what passed for the Iraqi Navy in the early 2000s actually possessed. At one point, I think there was a picture which demonstrated one of the helicopters the Marines were using was actually bigger than the Iraqi boat that they were sinking, and that particular boat was sunk by the expedient application of bayonet to side. But no, apparently that's a battleship, you know. And we also had a Scottish politician not too long ago, I think maybe a year or two ago, demanding why the Royal Navy didn't have any armoured ships guarding Scotland in the 2020s. Yeah, much as I like a battleship as much as anybody else, you are aware, my dude, that armour kind of lost its particular value at the top of the tier of naval shipping, unless you're talking about maybe deck armour on carriers, about 70 years ago, probably before the dude's parents were born. But yeah, apparently the lack of armoured warships in the Royal Navy represents something to do with why we all hate Scotland, or some other complete balderdash. So yeah, the journalists of the time period the channel covers really would have to rake into the gutter, or perhaps excavate below the gutter, to come up with the level of stupidity that modern journalists and politicians have managed to come up to for this kind of stuff. It is truly mind-boggling. I mean, there are also, the odd person in the comments who will show up in a video and clearly hasn't actually watched it at all, because they immediately start spouting off about something that's very clearly addressed in the video. One of my favourite ones is there's a handful of people who I think have commented on almost every video I've done about Hood, including, why Hood sank and the development of Hood, both of which explain in quite explicit detail how Hood did not have thin armour. And they're just like, oh yes, well, Hood sank because she had thin armour. Well, there's someone who didn't actually watch past the introduction, but never mind, thanks for the view and the comment and for the algorithm and all that kind of stuff. So I can't really begrudge them quite as much as people who actually get paid money to write about these things, and clearly, that one brain cell that's pinging around inside their skull is desperately, desperately looking for a way out. Herr Fuschfangschlager asks, given how important coordinated broadside fire was during Age of Sail combat, how exactly was fire discipline maintained? I imagine it had to be quite a challenge to coordinate hundreds of men in a badly lit, cramped space that could turn into a charnel house, and then you suffer casualties amongst any number of key personnel in the blink of an eye, not to mention that any veteran gun crew probably suffered from at least some amount of hearing damage. There were a whole combination of factors that went into maintaining fire discipline. Part of it was actually that, surprisingly, it could be relatively quiet at times, because bear in mind, obviously, there's no engine noises, motor noises, or anything like that. There's just the creak of the wind and the sails, unless the guns are firing. And even if the guns are firing on a ship somewhat far off, if they're several hundred yards away pointing in a different direction, and you've got 3 feet of oak between you and the outside world, it's still not going to be overpowering. So during those quieter periods when everyone's reloading and running out the guns, and quiet is a relative term, then the midshipmen or the lieutenants who are in charge could be telling everybody what the next plan is. So, if you're coming up on the stern of the Salvador del Mundo, as you can see here HMS Victory doing, this is going to be a predictable thing. You know that that's going to happen in the next 30 to 60 seconds. And so you would be yelling at everybody, okay, Spanish ship coming up, we're going to fire on her stern, fire as you bear, let's say, if they're going to do that. And you can repeat that, and people would repeat that order down the line. You have the gun captain and their second if they're incapacitated, and everyone, to a certain degree, when orders are being yelled, would literally be yelling, because, as you said, there would be a degree of hearing loss involved. And then once it comes to, okay, we are now got our broadside aimed at the stern of our target, you would yell the order to open fire or whatever, but there would also be some kind of dramatic hand signal, because then the masters of each gun could be looking down the length of the deck. There would be some smoke and so forth, but they'd be listening both for the yell to open fire and also looking for some kind of signal, maybe a fist raised and then dropped or something like that. And then, of course, they could initiate firing procedures on their cannon. And ultimately, even on the biggest ships of the line, there's not actually a huge amount of space. So trumpets, drums, yells, and hand signals can actually carry pretty much down the full gun deck length of pretty much any age of sail ship. And on smaller ships, third rates, frigates, etc., there's even less length for that to come down. And you might have a lieutenant or lieutenant, depending on which navy you're in, giving the initial order, but you might also have a relay of midshipmen going down the gun deck to relay those orders if you've got midshipmen to spare. John Benson asks, in a lot of literature that I've encountered, the second-rate ship of the line is typically held to be a poor rate of ship, having bad ship handling akin to a haystack, and throw weights that are equal to or surpassed in some cases by heavy 74s or 80 gunners. Despite this, the Royal Navy produced multiple classes of them throughout the American War of Independence, the 7 Years' War, the Revolutionary and Napoleonic Wars. And much of the heavyweight punch of the fleet at Trafalgar was composed of the Neptune class and the aforementioned haystack HMS Prince. By comparison, the Royal Navy only constructed 2 of the 80 gunners that were prevalent in other navies in lieu of the second rate. Was this a case of second rates being underrated in the history books, or did the Royal Navy have other reasons for building so many of them? There were quite a few reasons for building second rates. They were smaller and therefore cheaper than first rates, and so you could get considerably more of them for the money. Also, depending on the time period, it depends on the second rate. I mean, obviously you're talking mostly about the Napoleonic War period, and also perhaps slightly earlier. The comparison with third rates, 74s and 80s, is sometimes a little unfair, because it depends on what era you're looking at. Early second rates might have a 24-pounder main gun deck and then 18 or 12-pounders above, which then would mean that the later period heavy 74s and 80s, carrying French 36-pounders, for example, might outgun them in terms of total shot weight, but their contemporary third rates would also be carrying 24 or even 18-pounder main gun decks, so they would still have a firepower advantage at the time. It's just a second rate so armed might last 30, 40 years and then encounter a third rate with a theoretically heavier broadside. Whereas the later period second rates, the ones that are built at roughly the same time as the French start building 80-gunners, do tend to have 32-pounder main gun decks. They might then only have 18-pounders above rather than the 24-pounder and then 18 or 12 as on a first rate, but that's still overall considerably heavier broadside than most of the third rates they're going to encounter. Also, because they have an additional deck, they have additional quarters aft, which makes them suitable for being flagships with admirals and their staff aboard, which is very important because the Royal Navy has a lot of different stations which require an admiral, and trying to squeeze an admiral into a third rate is going to displace somebody in a rather unpopular manner. And because obviously the second rate is a somewhat cheaper vessel, and therefore there's a little less prestige associated with it, you can risk sending a second rate out as a station flagship on a far distant station, like, say, the Indian Ocean or somewhere, where it's still a three-decker and looks very impressive, but you would want to keep your very small number of first rates at home. And indeed, you actually see that even into the Ironclad and pre-Dreadnought period, where either older battleships or occasionally purpose-built second-rate battleships are sent out as, for example, China Station flagships, whereas the core strength of the battle fleet is conserved closer to home. And there are also structural issues which mean that the second rate actually still is a very valuable and powerful fighting ship, even if theoretically the total broadside weight might be exceeded by some of the big third rates. Firstly, because you're building it with 3 gun decks, that means you've got to build it to handle the weight of 3 gun decks, which means it's going to be built to a slightly heavier standard and therefore somewhat more durable than a third rate, as a rule. And because, again, it's got these 3 gun decks, that means its upper deck is going to be considerably higher than the 2 gun deck arrangement of any third rate, which means that in a combat situation where they get up close and personal, which, let's face it, a lot of Age of Sail battles do, you've got the third rate and the second rate. They can both exchange gunfire with 2 sets of gun decks, but then the second rate essentially has the choice of when and where to board the third rate, because it's got at least a half a deck to a deck's more height to it, which means that the third rate boarding the second rate is going to be very difficult, but the second rate boarding the third rate is going to be much, much easier. And of course, the second rate has a whole extra gun deck, which is majority free of risk from small arms fire, but which is at a level with the upper deck of the enemy, which can therefore sweep the enemy upper deck with grape shot and canister and all sorts of nasty things. Plus, you've got the deck guns on the open areas further up, which can then either aim down or aim at the rigging or whatever, and the men with small arms, who also again can shelter behind the gunnels, pop up and shoot down, and the gunnels of the third rate are not going to offer protection to their own crew. And to a certain extent, there's also the psychological factor, because if you look over and you see a whole bunch of 3-deckers coming straight at you, are you going to stop and start individually counting the number of gun ports where the difference might only be 1 or 2 per gun deck to work out which ones might be slightly less heavily armed than the others? Or are you just going to worry about the fact there's a bunch of 3-deckers bearing down on you, and that might have a psychological effect on the enemy? I mean, there's a reason that Nelson put all his relatively well-sailing 3-deckers at the head of his column at Trafalgar. So yes, while they are not the fastest or the easiest to handle, there are a number of good reasons why you would want to build a set of second rates if you are a navy like the Royal Navy. But it is somewhat circumstantial and situational. A navy like the US Navy or even the French and Spanish navies, generally speaking, don't have that intersection of needs that the Royal Navy did, which caused them to build second rates. And later on, and also in the very early stages of the second rate existing, it actually started out as a 2-decker with some additional guns, much as a lot of the US heavy frigates did, although they were single-deckers with another deck, mostly complete of heavy guns. Then, in the second rate's case, they went up to being 3-deckers, but then in the last few decades of the Age of Sail, they went back to being 2-deckers. So you can find 90 and 92 gun second rates in the 1830s and 1840s, but they are only 2-deckers. Corvus asks, on the IMDb page for the movie Greyhound, the Goofs page talks about the eponymous destroyer being a Fletcher class, which were not available until some months after the movie's setting. In Forrester's novel that the movie was based on, The Good Shepherd, Krause's ship was a Mahan-class destroyer, none of which were deployed to the Atlantic during the war. This got me to wondering, did the US Navy escort Atlantic convoys that early, just after the US entry into the war, mere months after Pearl Harbor? And if so, what classes of destroyer or destroyer escort were actually used? Well, at the time the US didn't have any destroyer escorts, but they did have destroyers, and oddly enough, believe it or not, the US was escorting Atlantic convoys before Pearl Harbor, and would continue to do so afterwards, because they had the neutrality patrol system in place. So originally you had a maritime security zone, which was declared at the beginning of World War II, and then it was extended, and then it was extended again, and essentially the neutrality patrols ostensibly were saying, look, we're neutral, don't mess with us, either of you. But of course the British had no reason to mess with the neutrality patrols, because the neutrality patrols were protecting quote-unquote neutral shipping, and if that neutral shipping was heading for the UK, well, why would the Royal Navy interfere with it? The only people who would have an issue with that would be the Germans, and of course that was kind of the point. It was a convoy escort without technically being an active war participant convoy escort. And the Germans were warned, if you attack a convoy that's under US protection within the neutrality zone, then you're violating it and you will be shot at. And the Germans would eventually take shots, and that included the destruction of the USS Reuben James, as seen here. Now, of the ships that were used, actually a fair number of different US destroyer classes were used. The neutrality patrols as a whole also used older battleships and some cruisers, but specifically in terms of the destroyers, the vast majority used were Wicks and Clemson class destroyers, quite a few of which had been dragged out of the reserves, because obviously the majority of the US modern destroyer fleet was being husbanded and or sent to the Pacific if it wasn't there already. But there were also some of the more modern US destroyer classes being used. So some of the Summers and Benham class destroyers were present, and a couple of Gleaves class as well were out there, as well as a few others. So yeah, the absence of the Mahans or Mahans, I don't, different people say it different ways, they are actually the exception to the rule when it comes to the overall spread of US destroyer classes. They were usually representatives of at least one or two classes out there in 41 and early 42, although obviously, yeah, the Fletchers weren't quite ready for that yet. Reaver's Rambling Recess asks, could you briefly describe the engineering challenges that resulted in the cylindrical armoured turrets evolving through open barbettes to finally reach the apex of the enclosed barbette, as opposed to someone developing the enclosed barbette in the first place? Were there particular engineering challenges to be resolved, or was the initial turret design something of an accidental dead end? The evolution of the turret is something that needs its own Wednesday video at some point, and it is in production somewhere down the list. But in brief, initially, the cylindrical turret made the most sense. It was, relatively speaking, compared to what we would consider in the Dreadnought era to be a turret, relatively easy to manufacture, relatively consistent all the way around. There were a couple of dead ends, like the Ericsson turret, where everything was jacked up on a central spindle in order to turn, so the Coles type with the exterior running around bearings and so forth, that was more the way of the future. However, there were some limitations that started to crop up as you went further and further down the line, and guns started to get bigger and critically also started to get longer when it comes to the cylindrical turret. Firstly, balance. With a cylindrical turret where near enough the walls of the turret approximate where the bearing track is, to balance that so it doesn't wear away artificially in some places or get stuck in particular places because one side weighs more than another, you can't vary the overall thickness of the turret's sides that much. which obviously means you get a more balanced turret. You can adjust the thickness a little bit, so you can have a little bit of a gun mantlet or whatever and have the back a little bit thinner, but then you have to adjust with a limited amount of machinery and weight internally. And that's a problem because as you need thicker and thicker turret faces, if you're having to extend that at least partially all the way around, the thing starts to get incredibly heavy. And that means you have to position it lower in the ship, which restricts your freeboard, which is why I'm using a picture of HMS Hood, the pre-dreadnought here, because she is the one of the Royal Sovereign class that's built with the old school turret as opposed to the open barbette that the Royal Sovereigns use. And if you look at a picture of a typical Royal Sovereign versus this picture of Hood, you can see the massive difference in freeboard. Still exactly the same armament, just a different way of mounting it. So the old school turret was on its way out partly because of that, whereas with eventually the enclosed barbette, you can have the turret faceplate be very, very heavily armoured, and then you can have the sides and the back at much thinner rates of armour, because the back can extend considerably further back beyond the actual barbette ring, which means that you can then put a little bit of weight on it in terms of armour or some counterweight or whatever, and balance everything out without too much effort. Another element is space, because if you want to increase the internal volume of the turret to fit bigger guns or make it somewhat less cramped for the gun crews, you have to increase the barbette diameter as well as the turret diameter, and there's a limited amount of beam to a ship. Plus, of course, you don't necessarily, if you can avoid it, want the barbette right out close to the edge of the ship, because that compromises some of the protection. And as they found out later on, again, with the 5.25-inch gun mounts, a circular turret actually, once you've got the guns in there, doesn't give you a huge amount of room to play with. One of the early attractions of the turret was that with the older, shorter barrel guns like you have in the 1860s and 1870s, you could actually get the gun to retract completely into the turret, which would allow you to reload it from inside. But as guns got longer, and that was no longer possible, and then you were just left with a really cramped working environment, and even with the introduction of breech loaders, so you could avoid some of the slightly more interesting external reloading mechanisms, if you haven't got all that much room within the turret to bring up the shells and the charges and use the loading mechanisms and everything, it's cramped, it's heavy, and there's not really a lot of room for expansion. So one of the first things was, well, if we take off the gun housing and just keep the barbette, then we can have everything a lot higher, which is better anyway for arcs of fire and so forth, and sea keeping of the ship. And because everybody else theoretically has low freeboard guns, then they would have to fire up, which would mean that if everyone can duck down into the barbette, or ideally when they tried even retracting guns within a barbette at one point, then people should be relatively safe. Of course, they realised there very quickly, as everyone else did it, that this wasn't going to work out quite as much, and then you have sharpshooters and Gatling guns and the hail of fire and everything. And so initially you start off with splinter-proofed gun houses being built around the barbette, and then it very rapidly starts to accumulate armour, and you end up with the enclosed, fully armoured barbette, aka the modern turret. And most of the issues we mentioned with the original enclosed turret, the cylindrical one, are obviated by having this gun house that doesn't need to conform to the barbette diameter quite as much. We've talked already about internal volume and armour thickness and balance and so forth, but it now becomes possible, within reason, to plan out the floor space internal to a turret by what you need in terms of men and hoists and loading equipment and so forth, as compared to the older style. And obviously as guns get more powerful as well, having that ability to have the turret essentially overhang past the back of the barbette means that you can cope with a recoil a lot more as well, whilst also holding, eventually, as it turns out, things like rangefinders and fire control equipment and so forth. Vokir asks, if Gorgon had been accepted back by the Norwegians at the end of World War I, presumably with some extra British cash to dredge out the Drydock a little wider, and had been in Narvik along with Norgay and Eidsvold, do you think it could have contributed significantly to the defence of the harbour? Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, unlike Norge and Eidsvold, which had a degree of open back shielded guns, all of Gorgon's primary and secondary battery is within gun turrets, which are quite heavily armoured, and she herself is quite heavily armoured. So at anything except absolute point-blank range, the German destroyer's guns are not going to do anything to her critical elements. Obviously, again, you can smash up external bits and pieces, but Gorgon would be more than capable of doing the same in return. Obviously, she probably would have reclaimed her original Norwegian name, Nidaros, I think. And yeah, I mean, especially if she'd been kind of backstopping Norge and Eidsvold, then would she have lasted against the entire German destroyer complement? Possibly not. There were a lot of German destroyers, and they do have a lot of torpedoes and a lot of guns. But she certainly could have seriously messed them up, because, of course, as we know, both Norge and Eidsvold were sunk pretty quickly by German torpedoes, but with the absolutely hilarious bulges on Gorgon, and we know to a certain extent how effective those were, considering how much of punishment it took to put down Glatten when she caught fire, although admittedly German torpedoes are a little bit more powerful. I deeply suspect that had the destroyers engaged Gorgon, aka Nidaros, even if they'd put down Norge and Eidsvold previously, yeah, they could have sent a salvo or two of torpedoes at her. They would have slammed into the bulges, exploded, at which point Nidaros, I guess at that point, would have turned around and essentially done the equivalent of a slightly more aggressive version of that night at the end of Indiana Jones and The Last Crusade, just pointing multiple 6-inch and 9.2-inch guns at the German destroyers at point-blank range with that massive tripod helping with fire control and going, "You chose poorly," before promptly obliterating at least one of the destroyers with point-blank range gunfire from 9.2-inch high explosive rounds, which would have been comically hilarious. And at that point, I think there would have been something of a prolonged struggle, because getting close enough in the snowstorms to engage with gunfire would have definitely been in the Norwegians' favour, because, you know, even at that close range, the armour would have stood a decent chance of deflecting the German shells. The German destroyers do not have the armour to deflect the Norwegian shells in exchange, and the Norwegian shells are considerably larger, especially coming from the 4.5 9.2-inch. And yeah, you could put more torpedoes into her, but as long as you don't hit in the same place twice, the bulges are going to be like, cool. What else have you got? I suspect eventually a combination of gunfire and torpedoes would overcome poor old Nidaros at that point. But then when Warburton Lee's flotilla shows up a little bit later on, there's probably just going to be maybe 2 or 3 very, very shell-shocked and traumatized German destroyers left standing, and the whole thing might be over there and then. TST1987 asks, what are the political and technical consequences of the British adopting a Japanese treaty tonnage accounting method and actually just launching the King George V's in 1939 as originally planned, with 12 14-inch guns in 3 quad turrets? All the protection and speed the Royal Navy wants, but of course they're now several thousand tons overweight like their Axis counterparts. My own suspicion is, apart from a few hypocritical tut-tuts from the Axis press and Parliament, not much will happen on a political front, notwithstanding the early retirement of the offending naval architects and a withering glare from Admiral King. The treaty system's well and truly dead by this time anyways. What's your analysis and opinion? Well, you're spot on with the design probably coming in several thousand tons overweight, because as you noted in the rest of your question, part of the reason for switching B turret to a twin was to comply with the treaty weight limits, but part of it was also to get the speed and protection they wanted after having increased the coverage of the belt. There were questions about the stability of the ship. Now, this has to be borne in mind. That's questions about the stability compared to the stability the Navy wanted. That's not to imply it's going to turn into the Mary Rose all of a sudden. It just wouldn't quite be as stable as the Royal Navy ideal, and the Royal Navy did like its ships to be fairly stable because of, obviously, the rough weather they have to deal with. So if they're going to have all the protection and the speed and the quad turret. Well, obviously the quad turret and its barbettes can take up a bit more space than a twin, so the hull is going to have to be ever so slightly larger, and a little bit more on the beam, which will probably help address the stability issues. But of course, all of that adds weight, and with the slightly larger hull will come a little bit more space. Maybe squeeze a little extra machinery in there, or maybe just uprate it very slightly, because obviously they've still got to get the 27, 28 knots out of the thing. Probably fairly doable with relatively minimal changes. And then you get something that looks a bit like this. Politically speaking, I think a lot of it is going to depend on how much the Royal Navy admits at the time, because when the North Carolinas were eventually completed with their 16-inch guns, they were overweight, although like the King George V, they did make their best efforts to come in at 35,000 tons. And the US Navy obviously internally knows that the North Carolinas are a bit over 35,000 tons, so I don't think they're going to be hugely objecting to King George V, especially because obviously, bear in mind, originally the North Carolinas were also going to be 12, 14-inch ships. So the fact the British have come up with a 12, 14-inch ship, okay, it's more heavily protected than the North Carolinas, but it also carries fewer secondary guns, and the aft superstructure is a little less massive. So if the British insist that, no, yeah, it's tight, but, we're actually legitimately on 35k tons, it's going to be a lot more difficult to challenge them on it than it would be something like Bismarck. I mean, yeah, you could eventually prove that actually it's probably over, but by how much, and, are you going to get much traction out of it? So yeah, the political element of it by 39 onwards is basically going to be negligible. In terms of the practical, technical consequences, well, it is a little bit difficult, because essentially it comes down to RNG. Because the number of guns that the King George V class carries realistically only makes any difference at all in 3 engagements, 2 of which are with Bismarck and 1 is with Scharnhorsts. Now, the sinking of Bismarck, if King George V is carrying 12 guns instead of 10, Bismarck might sink very slightly faster because it might get hit by a few extra shells. Not really much odds. Scharnhorst, that could be interesting, because of course Scharnhorst, as we know, nearly made it away before one of Duke of York's shells crippled part of its machinery. If you're looking at a situation where Duke of York is able to add another couple of guns to the equation right from the start, and bear in mind her gunnery was pretty good right from that beginning, then it's entirely possible that, RNG placement of those additional shells, Scharnhorst might be crippled or slowed down considerably earlier, or it might go roughly the same way as it did, but either way Scharnhorst is down, it might be a bit quicker. The more interesting one, of course, is the first one, when Prince of Wales is engaging Bismarck, because as we know from the engagement of the Battle of Denmark Strait, Prince of Wales hits Bismarck considerably before Bismarck hits Hood, and is only able to engage with its forward turrets, so it's only able to shoot 6 guns. If it's able to shoot 8 guns with the level of accuracy that Prince of Wales did, scoring the number of hits that she did, statistically adding another couple of guns to the equation would probably maybe give Prince of Wales an extra hit or 2 before Hood goes up. And then, of course, where are those hits landing? Because the circumstances of Hood's destruction are so, to the second precise, as in, if anything changes up to and including the salvo being fired a few seconds early or a few seconds late, then statistically speaking, it's very unlikely that that's going to happen. And, okay, yeah, most of the time in these kinds of scenarios, you either have to add in something quite major to make a difference where Bismarck doesn't take that fatal salvo shot, or you have to rely on just rolling the same dice as were historically rolled and just coming up with slightly different results. Whereas this is just a very subtle change, but could make all the difference, because, you're, as I said, statistically likely to get that extra hit or 2. It's just a matter of where that hit comes. If that hit hits the conning tower or the superstructure and therefore disrupts or destroys either the command crew or fire control, Bismarck's very unlikely to be taking that shot. If the hit lands on the turrets or sets a major fire in the secondary battery or even gets a good flooding hit elsewhere or something like that, basically anything other than just destroying a random bit of the boat deck or the aircraft catapult or smashing into the main belt armor, there could be some serious consequences. I mean, it might not be long-term serious consequences, but consequences enough to make Bismarck change course or hold its fire for a minute while it's switching over fire control systems or something. And even if a hit lands on the belt armor, if it penetrates the belt armor, even if it doesn't get through the deck plating, the turtleback, it's still going to cause flooding, and that will subtly change Bismarck's course and speed and angle, which again could affect everything else. So, yeah, you never know. I think probably the single most consequential outcome of a 12-gun King George V is it might, and I stress the word might, simply by changing lots of little butterflies, might save Hood. Explicitly Implicit asks, the Napier Deltic engine was a high-performance diesel engine used primarily in marine applications that was very advanced for its time. Would it be possible or advantageous to use a Deltic-derivative as an engine powering a tank or armoured fighting vehicle? Theoretically, yes, and I understand there were smaller versions of the Deltic engine type which potentially could have fitted into tanks. The problem is I'm not a massive aficionado of the Deltic, so although I know the basic dimensions of the baseline D18 model and I think it's D18, it's something 18, anyway, and some of the larger variants, I know those are too large to fit into tanks and AFVs, which of course also aren't particularly my speciality. But of course on things like Royal Navy fast attack craft, like you can see here, didn't matter quite so much. But if one of the smaller ones, like a baby Deltic or something, was small enough to fit into a tank, especially at the time in the 50s and 60s, it would be absolutely hilarious because you'd be talking about an engine that's still generating well over 1,000 horsepower in an era when, several hundred horsepower was more the norm. So any such tank, whether it be a Conqueror or whatever, that was fitted with some Deltic derivative would be moving at truly ludicrous speeds, assuming that the whole thing didn't shake itself apart. And I mean, if it wasn't for the fact that a full-size Deltic is about twice the size of a modern main battle tank power pack, it would also be highly, highly hilarious to fit one into the back of a modern tank because, well, at maximum output, the standard production line Deltic from the 1940s could produce 2,500 horsepower. That's considerably more than what you'll find in any modern tank. Paul from Chicago asks, thoroughly enjoyed your recent video on the Congos, and I agree with it, but could you address the subdivision argument? As I understand it, the block coefficient of the Congos increased fairly significantly during refit. This was particularly a result of increased structural integrity with new girders and frames and that sort of thing. I could see that making a difference in terms of survivability compared to side armour. Maybe improved subdivision and support is more important than another 2 to 3 inches of armour. Granted, subdivision does help with absorbing damage. However, it is very much a second line all else you've tried to do has failed measure, because if you are relying on subdivision internally to mitigate damage, you are acknowledging that you have taken damage internally, which in and of itself is a pretty bad thing. Look at Italia, for example, not the renamed Littorio class, the Italia, the ironclad. When they decided they were going to do away with armor entirely, the first thing they did was massively subdivide the ship in order to try and preserve buoyancy to a degree. But even then, they acknowledged it was possibly being somewhat hopeful. And obviously, yeah, if you have 2 to 3 inches more armor, there's a chance you might keep the shell out entirely, and then you don't have to worry about subdivision. You could have a hull compartment that ran a third of the length of the ship and went from one side of the hull to the other, just a complete massive open compartment, assuming the rest of the structure could support it, And it wouldn't make the blindest bit of difference in terms of protection if the armour is thick enough to keep the shells from poking holes in there in the first place. Of course, realistically, you have torpedoes and other structural considerations to take into account, but you kind of get the point. So, if your armour is letting or potentially going to let shells in, then yeah, okay, subdivision might help you, but also subdivision, you can't subdivide the magazines past a certain point. You can't subdivide the machinery rooms past a certain point. And especially with things like machinery rooms, when you do subdivide them, although it does increase overall survivability, it does also make operating the blasted things rather more difficult because it makes everything a bit more cramped and a bit more difficult to get around. And the other thing is, having lots of subdivision isn't really a specific characteristic of a battleship. Yes, battleships do have good subdivision, but so do a bunch of other things. Destroyers, and to a certain extent, especially when dealing with underwater threats, cruisers of the period have to rely on subdivision as their primary defense because they just do not have either the whole volume completely, in the case of destroyers, or the beam in the case of cruisers, to have traditional torpedo defense and, to a certain extent, mine defense mechanisms, or indeed all that much armor against medium to large caliber shells. And so they have to rely on just subdivision to have even a chance of survival. So improving the subdivision, that's not a characteristic of a capital ship. That's just a characteristic of a ship that is potentially more likely to take catastrophic internal damage than most, which isn't actually necessarily a massive vote of confidence. So yes, while improving subdivision would somewhat increase the Kongo's durability in a long-term firefight, in and of itself, it doesn't really change all that much in terms of where the Kongo sit on the battlecruiser to battleship spectrum, in my opinion. If they were going to rely on improved subdivision to make the ship more durable, well, given the fact that an 8-inch belt isn't going to stop an incoming battleship shell anyway, they might as well at that point have gone full Italia, stripped off the belt armour, made the thing look like a honeycomb, and then replaced the gun turrets with 16 or 18-inch things and basically made it a modern Italia. Having a bit more subdivision when your armour's still going to let in a bunch of shells, all it really means is that as long as those shells that went straight through your armour didn't hit something really critical, like, say, the magazines, you'll stay afloat a little bit longer than otherwise, but you're probably still going down. See Hiei, for example. Lord Nelson asks, during the late 18th and early 19th centuries, the French were known to prefer the fire at the upward swing technique, aiming mainly at the enemy's rigging. Is there any notable incident where this tactic resulted in a favourable outcome as compared to shooting at the hull? Yes, although exactly how many incidents depend on exactly how you define favourable. There were a number of actions where the actual outcome of the battle itself was perhaps inconclusive at best, but the French would take an overall strategic victory from the fact that they were still capable of sailing around and able to engage in action the next day, whereas the British fleet would then decline to resume the action. Thus, if that sort of preserves the status quo, and if the status quo was in favour of the French, then that's a net French win. And that did happen occasionally, because although the French ships might have taken something of a battering to the hull from British gunnery, quite often in battles with, especially extended battles with French vessels, you would have one or more British ships either dismasted or close to dismasted, very badly shot up in the rigging, thus either difficult or impossible to control, and therefore potentially quite easy to be captured. And the rest of the British fleet would, as the action broke off, tend to kind of group and cluster around them to protect them and help them make repairs. But then, if you've engaged in a 20-on-20 action and the next morning dawns and, let's say, 4 or 5, 6 of your ships really aren't going to go anywhere fast, and certainly would be very difficult to control in a line action in terms of station keeping, then you probably decline the action until you can either get reinforcements or complete further repairs to those ships, at which point let's say, net French win. In single ship actions, there were a number of actions where by shooting up the rigging it enabled the French ship to then escape, which is technically a favourable outcome compared to being captured. And even in some cases where the French lost a battle, by primarily engaging with the enemy's rigging, it would mean that when the battle was resolved in the favour of the British in most cases, then again, because of damage to their upper works, they would have to satisfy themselves with what Nelson would consider to be a partial victory, and some of the rest of the French fleet would escape. So, for example, I believe it was Admiral Hawke was part of an engagement, one of the many engagements off Ushant, where his comparatively smaller fleet essentially gradually overhauled and double-teamed a slightly larger French fleet and kind of nibbled them off one by one. But whilst in theory this should have allowed him to eventually take all of the French ships by essentially enacting local superiority one at a time, in the end he had to satisfy himself with some ships taken, others damaged but escaped, and still others almost, compared to some of the others, undamaged and able to escape, simply because a good chunk of his ships were physically incapable of keeping up the pursuit after a certain point in the battle because of how much damage they'd taken to their rigging. And occasionally, where enemy gunnery was pretty appalling, taking the time to disable the enemy's rigging first would then give the French a complete victory, because once you've disabled the enemy's ability to maneuver, you can then sail to a comparatively advantageous position and pound away at will until they give up. So there's a whole slew of circumstances where it either is favourable completely, although that's somewhat rarer, but there's a lot of other circumstances where it somewhat makes the situation more favourable compared to what could have been. If the gods had wanted us to be happy, they would have given us a honey-based alcoholic beverage. Oh, look, Mead asks, in Drydock 302, you answered my question about loopholing the Washington and London naval treaties to build an honestly not a fleet destroyer governor class of treaty-compliant gunboats that could be turned into fleet destroyers once war was declared or the treaty system collapsed. At the end of the answer, you came up with an interesting point that I'll ask you now. Would it be worth it to build this honestly not a fleet destroyer governor class of gunboat versus just building new destroyers once war was declared or the treaties collapsed? Well, as I think I may have mentioned in that question, my main hesitation with the idea would be that for the vast majority of cases where you could actually pull off the deception and people not just see through it very easily, you would have to do so much structural work internally to the ship in question that by the time you've taken it in, cut it apart, put in the new sections, put all the old stuff back on top, and recommissioned it, if you've got good fast yards, then you probably could just build new destroyers and just do that quicker. However, there are a few circumstances where the idea might have some merit. Firstly, to make it realistically work, you would have to construct these ships very close to the margin of being destroyers. So almost a destroyer hull, which would be a bit of a giveaway anyway, just with perhaps really oversized gun mountings. So maybe have 3 really oversized gun mountings that have really luxuriously placed single gun mounts, and they'd have to be what the British would term upper deck mounts, i.e. mounts that don't really pierce through the decks. And of course no torpedo launchers, because you're not allowed that in your loophole area, but maybe some kind of lightly constructed superstructure for crew accommodation that just suspiciously happens to have the mounting points for torpedoes or torpedo launchers concealed within. And then you'd pretty much have to have designed the ship already as a fleet destroyer with all the link-ups and everything ready to accept an additional block of power plant, and then just not include that and blank off those bits of the pipe work and so forth and hope that that works. Now, if you did all of that, and you separately, perhaps on the actual fleet destroyers you're building at the time in small numbers, you have the twin gun mountings that you actually want to use, you could maybe get away with building a bunch of those and say they're just spares, and the same with torpedo launchers and say they're just spares, warehouse them, even possibly the same with boilers and so forth, and say, oh no, these are all just ready-use spares for our fleet destroyers. At which point, if you also had, let's say, the hull plating directly over your empty compartment, specifically designed to be quickly and easily removed, then in theory, the conversions could be done substantially faster than building a brand new destroyer. Because at that point, I mean, you'd probably still want to dry dock the ship for stability purposes, but in theory, you might even be able to get away without dry docking it, especially if you over-ballasted them to keep them down to a planned waterline, and then you just remove the ballast when you stick the new engines in. Because at that point, again, in theory, you could even just, have them alongside, go, okay, right, day one, lift these plates, and everything, our upgrade pack has been pre-positioned. Day two, we're lifting in the new machinery, and down goes the plate over the top, engineers down below reconnecting and warming everything up, while other people are trucking out all the ballast, so the ship takes back on an even keel. And then day three, while everybody is down below doing that, you just lift off the old guns, the singles, pop in the new ones, and then maybe day four you pop down the torpedo launchers. Day five, you're adding the extra equipment with all this for all the new weaponry and so forth. And hopefully by the end of the week, if you're really lucky and you've absolutely swarmed the thing with men, you'll have the machinery all hooked up, ready to test, and off you go. And you're not really going to beat producing, you're not going to beat getting a new fleet destroyer effectively in a week or two. Now, that's very, very generous and assuming absolutely everything goes perfectly like clockwork. But in theory, you might be able to pull it off. Of course, where you're pulling all those men from elsewhere in your war effort, that's another matter. But it could be done, but it'd be threading an extremely fine needle with an extremely fine thread to get into a position where it would actually be worth the time and effort pre-war, as opposed to just building new destroyers during wartime, and yet not managing to fool everyone else so they don't realize what you're doing. Captain Gordon Freeman of the Intergalactic House of Pancakes asks, you've mentioned several times that British performance at the Battle of Jutland would have been much greater if their shells didn't detonate too early. How do base fused shells work, and how is the detonation delay set and adjusted? There are a few different ways for a base fused shell to work, but most of them are variations on a theme. This is a diagram of a base fuse, by the way. So what happens is once the fuse is armed as the shell leaves the barrel or shortly thereafter, when the shell hits something substantial enough, then the pressure plate, which is the big red bit you can see on the bottom left of the top left part of the diagram, that moves forward because obviously the shell itself is coming to a stop, but at the back this free element is still moving forward, so that will set off some kind of mechanical trigger. Depending on what kind of shell it is, the exact mechanism can be a little bit different. That will then initiate a small detonator when the firing pin springs forward or backwards or whatever it happens to be, depending on the shell design. And that in turn will light some kind of small amount of explosive. Very often it'll be some kind of black powder train, but it could be all sorts of things. In some of the cases, it was even a crystal of explosive that would burn through. But essentially the point of it is that whatever your delay element is, now there is obviously a minimum delay caused by how quickly the mechanical elements initiate, but beyond that, whatever this delaying explosive element is after that initial primer is set off, its burn rate, which is still going to be in fractions of a second, dictates how long the delay on the shell detonation is, because once that burns through, then that reaches to the detonator, the booster charge, and the main charge, and up goes the shell, because once it reaches that point, the detonation is going to happen in fractions of a second. I mean, the whole thing is over in a few larger fractions of a second, but still. There are a few subtle variations to this, so there is an option with some base fuses that they won't actually even begin that sequence once the deceleration, the fairly significant deceleration, has initiated the whole thing, but the mechanical firing pin sequence on some shells won't even initiate until the deceleration is finished, which gives you a longer period for the shell to penetrate, but runs the risk, of course, of the shell potentially coming apart or being substantially damaged during the course of the deceleration. And to change the detonation delay is essentially, well, whatever your little trail element of explosive is, how long or large is that, or how sensitive is it, how quickly will it burn through? It's not the kind of thing that can really be adjusted in situ. It has to be decided upon manufacture of the fuse in the vast majority of cases. With British shells detonating too early, a good chunk of it was simply because of the main explosive, because the premise of all of these base fuses is that the main explosive won't go off from the shock of impact. It needs to be set off by the booster charge, which needs to be set off by a detonator, which is activated by the trail, which is in turn activated by the primer, which is activated by the mechanical elements right at the beginning of the whole train. Some of the early British shells at Jutland, some of them, the main core of the explosive was so sensitive that simply the shock of impact, would set that off, completely bypassing the fuses themselves. And in other cases, the fuses, for various reasons, just didn't work very well at high impact angles and wouldn't actually detonate the shells at all, which would then lead to a low order or partial detonation when the still quite sensitive main explosive came in contact with fragments, and very hot fragments, as the shell came apart immediately after the impact, and various permutations in between. For example, if the shell fuse isn't properly designed, and very early fuses, high angles of incidence could be a problem, then that high angle of incidence, the impact obviously not just being fore to aft on the shell, but also somewhat side to side, could jar or jolt the trace element, or the trail of explosive, that's that very, very short delay. It could jar it out of place or put it out, at which point the fuse won't initiate. Andrew Dederer asks, the Royal Navy gets a lot of stick for forgetting or foregoing convoys for most of World War I. I wonder, was this path of thinking a side effect of Fisher's consolidation in the home fleet and the mass scrapping of many ancient show-the flagships? Did pulling the main combatants and their high-ranking captains back to the UK leave the remote stations without any sort of forces and pull to fight the proper escort plans? We know that the Admiralty would meddle via wireless. Did the power imbalance contribute to foregoing convoys? Partially, it's a side effect of Fisher's consolidation of the home fleet, which will then later become the Grand Fleet. Not necessarily for the exact reasons you described, though. So part of it is that convoys need escorts. That's one very, very big lesson. But when Fisher consolidates most of the Royal Navy's modern capital ships into what will eventually become the Grand Fleet, that in turn means they need a very substantial escort force, which means a good chunk of the modern cruisers and destroyers also get pulled into the soon-to-be Grand Fleet. That in turn means that the number of cruisers and destroyers available for non-Grand Fleet work, especially once you discount the ships that are on the Harwich Patrol and the Dover Patrol, or the Harwich Force, I should say, and the Battle Cruiser Fleet, once that becomes a separate thing, suddenly you're left with not really all that many destroyers and cruisers elsewhere. And obviously the Royal Navy has some other fairly major commitments, like initially the Dardanelles campaign and so forth. And what's left over, as well as being relatively small in number, is relatively sort of second rank and a little bit obsolete. And when you therefore look at what do you need to protect a convoy when there are full-scale German warships out there, admittedly cruisers, but still they are full-scale warships, plus some fairly heavily armed merchant cruisers. Well, conventional thinking says that if you can't escort the convoys properly, then it's better not to have them, because if they're not properly escorted and a proper long-range warship comes upon them, well, you've just gathered all the targets into one convenient place. So at that point, it's better, in theory, to have them all scattered to the four winds, because then you can only find one or two. Obviously, that neglects the entire lesson of convoys from the Age of Sail, which is if they're scattered all across the place, then you can always find one or two every few days and gradually rack up your kill count or capture count without really much of anything that the enemy can do to stop you. But you can kind of see the line of reasoning involved. And although there were some forces available, so some convoy escorts could be provided, it wasn't anywhere near enough to provide enough escorts for all the convoys. And again, you could chance it with escorting, say, 30% of the convoys and hope that the enemy surface raiders would run into those ones, but statistically they're more likely to run into the unescorted ones. And there was also a little bit of a concern that because the relative speed of warships versus merchant ships had diverged quite a bit from the Age of Sail, when, whilst, okay, they weren't necessarily the same, it wasn't quite the 2 or 3 times speed difference that it was in World War One. Therefore, the whole leaving most of the seas empty tactic they thought would be less effective, because a high-speed warship would be able to comb fairly large tracts of the sea until eventually it came across a rich, juicy target. And even in the last part of World War One, once Jellicoe was persuaded to release a good chunk of Grand Fleet destroyers to help with convoy escort work, even then, when the US gets involved, pretty much the first thing the Royal Navy asks for is for a bunch of destroyers to help escort the convoys. While 6th Battle Squadron is a welcome addition to the Grand Fleet, if the Royal Navy had a gun put to its head and said, told, well, you can either have Admiral Sims and all his destroyers, or you can have the 6th Battle Squadron, you wouldn't have finished your sentence before the Royal Navy was telling you they wanted the destroyers. There are a bunch of other reasons that the Royal Navy didn't go in for merchant convoys in the early to mid part of World War One, but those are some of the larger practical reasons. John M. asks, in several Drydock questions you've made quips about armament companies. My question is, just how did the various companies go about peddling their wares? Were there dedicated staff, steamer trunks packed with technical material at the ready to depart to various nations? Or did the diplomatic or military attachés at various nations perhaps get wind of their host nation's desires, contact the appropriate governmental department, and let ambassadors or state secretaries go about trying to make the sale? And just how much latitude were those companies given? Did friendships arise from the competing sales forces? It varies a little bit depending on the exact nature of the relationship between the armament companies and the state when it comes to foreign sales. So, for example, in Germany, selling warship designs overseas is as much a matter of national pride as it is Krupp doing some really good business and making some additional profit. And so the Imperial German Navy and the German state is going to be much more willing to provide additional material and shows of force, like showing the flag with a battle cruiser or whatever, to help drive German efforts to sell weapons and ships to foreign countries. And in the US, a combination of diplomatic pressure where they thought it would work, government subsidies by any other name, and various other sort of diplomatic twists of the arm would be used slightly differently to Germany, but in the States, it was very much a case of, well, if an American company makes money, that's good. If a foreign company makes money, that's bad. And the state is trying to leverage the American companies into making money, but it's more about the making of the money than it is about national pride. The national pride part is still there, don't get me wrong, but as far as the Germans are concerned, for example, it's perhaps a little bit more about the pride than the money, whereas for the Americans, it seems to be more about the money than the pride. Anyway, that's not to say, of course, that money or pride are not motivating factors for British companies, but there are a lot more British companies who are often competing against each other. And so, as far as the British government is concerned, if Britain gets stuck saying, okay, well, we actually favour Vickers So we're going to make diplomatic efforts to get you to accept the Vickers designs, whereas perhaps Armstrong is more in favour with the local government. This is before Vickers became Vickers Armstrong. That could put them in an awkward situation. So the British government tended to find themselves in the position of perhaps pushing diplomatically to, yeah, please consider a British design with more favour, but they were less likely to recommend a specific company as opposed to the Germans or the Americans, who would very much push a single company in most cases. But that's just foreign sales. Even internally, using Britain as an example, because for this kind of time period, they're the ones building the most ships, there's also quite a lot of ins and outs in government service, naval service, and private service. So some designers, some very senior designers, would leave government or naval service and go and work for a private company. When they then came back, depending on what terms they'd left the private company on, and some of them would do this, they'd serve in the Director of Naval Construction's office, they'd perhaps even be the Director of Naval Construction, then they'd go off and work for a private company, and sometimes they'd come back to the Navy. Now, if they'd left that company on good terms, then they suddenly, magically, would become very much an advocate of that company's products back within the Navy. Of course, if they left on bad terms, then they would probably not advocate for those companies' products, might deliberately advocate for somebody else's products. And then you have the salesmen themselves who, when they are, because the salesmen at this point, they have to operate almost as an ancillary arm of the designers, because they can only really offer what the designers can physically produce. But, for example, if there is a tender for a specific kind of ship and the specs are out there, sometimes the shipyard or the private company in question will put together their bid, and the salesman will have to go and say, well, this is our bid, this is what you said you wanted, here's what you wanted, this is the price, this is why we're the best people to do it. But then sometimes you have people like the poor old Vickers guys who are trying to sell their 14-inch guns in the early 1910s, and much as the good old Roman senator who ended every speech with Carthago delenda est, you look through some of the period sources, and Vickers were beginning to get on some people's nerves, in as much as you would ask them for a spec or a design that matches a set of criteria that you've come up with, and they might well come up with that, but then they would also show up with an alternative version to what you'd asked for that just happened to include the Vickers 14-inch gun instead of what you'd asked for. Mark Griffiths asks, I am aware that the manufacturing of blocks for age-of-sail ships was one of the early industrialized processes. What other naval requirements drove industrialization of manufacturing? There were a few at different time periods. Cannon were one of them, especially as things became more and more precise, because cannon, obviously, up until maybe the 1870s, when broadside ironclads started giving way to central battery, cannon had to be ordered in extremely large numbers, and then they had to be maintained. And when they were produced, okay, a 32-pounder smoothbore cannon circa 1800 isn't necessarily the most finely engineered of weapons. The bore may be slightly variable from gun to gun, hence the amount of windage you have to leave in the thing. But you do need them to be, broadly speaking, of the approximately the same weight and durability, because when you've got, up to 120 or more of the things, not necessarily 32 pounds, but 120 plus guns aboard, if, a bunch of them are significantly heavier than others, and by sheer happenstance you end up putting the heavier ones on the port side and the lighter ones on the starboard side, that could lead to some interesting listing issues, amongst other things. So you definitely have to semi-industrialize the manufacture of cannon. Gunpowder, related to cannon, there's a whole thing about the development of gunpowder and the fact that gunpowder mills, as opposed to artisanal making of gunpowder, has to come about in large part to supply the vast amount of artillery that navies need. Yes, of course, you also need powder to supply land armies and muskets and that kind of thing, but if you compare the amount of powder that would be expended in, say, a mid to late 1600s army field battle with all of its field artillery and muskets and pistols and so forth, and then compare that to the amount of powder that would be expended in a fleet battle of the same time period, those two numbers are very, very different. Rope manufacture was another one, because rope, again, you wanted rope to be of a specific thickness and a specific durability, and you wanted that to be a reliable, interchangeable thickness and durability. You didn't want to have to go sorting through your rope locker in the middle of a storm and going, oh, hang on a minute, no, this guy made this rope, so we've just had a main rope or main line snap up in the rigging, but that one was 2 inches thick, but that was made by this guy, and the one that has the same yield strength or better that's made by this other guy is actually 2.5 inches thick. Now, where the heck did I put the 2.5 inch thick rope, and is it from that particular manufacturer? You do not want that. So you have fairly standardized rope manufacturing techniques developed as well. Those are the main other ones when it comes to the age of sail. Once you get into the age of steam and iron and steel, it starts to multiply out quite exponentially. But rope, cannon, powder, and blocks for the rigging are some of the biggest drivers for industrialization in the age of sail, at least from a naval perspective. Andrew Waite asks, would reconstructing HMS Malaya along the lines of the modernized QEs in the second half of 1943 have been a better use of the ship than placing her into reserve at the end of 1943? Unfortunately for poor old Malaya, probably not. Because if you look at the refits of Valiant and Queen Elizabeth, you're talking about 2.5 to 3 years on average to get the modernization done. Malaya is in an even more worn state because she's been doing heavy wartime duty, so you'd be pushing further out on that window. And of course, it's in the middle of war. Okay, yes, the war is going somewhat better for the Allies in 44 and 45 than it is in 40 or 41 or 42. But there are still constraints of war. I mean, there were even constraints on completing the much more useful Vanguard at the time. So there is essentially zero chance if you put Malaya into modernization, let's say in August 43, there is no chance at all of her being ready before the very, very, very end of 1945, beginning of 1946 at the earliest, assuming that for some reason they made her a priority, and more realistically, probably not till the end of 1946, at which point, yes, you would get a brand new modernized Queen Elizabeth, but even by the most generous, or well, most pessimistic, I should probably say, estimates, by that point, the war with Japan would be well into the we've taken large chunks of the Japanese home islands and we just need shore bombardment. You don't need to spend 2.5, 3, 4 years modernizing an old Queen Elizabeth to do that. And then in a post-war environment, which obviously historically is what you would have ended up with, yes, she would have been fresh out of the yards, but the standard for modern capital ship in the post-war environment would be considerably faster than she is, with a considerably heavier secondary battery than would be realistically possible to fit onto her. And yeah, compared to Vanguard, which would be coming into service at around the same time, it would just not really be worth it. Except, of course, if you were from the future and you were forcing the British government to spend all this money through hindsight to essentially have the ship decommissioned straight into being a museum ship. Eric Knapp asks, the Lovell Telescope at the Jodrell Bank Observatory was built with 2 circular 15-inch turret drive gear sets and the associated pinions from the 15-inch gun turrets from the World War I battleships HMS Revenge and Royal Sovereign. Do you know of any other conversions of warship parts into scientific platforms? Well, there are the conversion of some ex-military ships into scientific research ships, but in terms of parts, I'm less certain about that, although, being a post-1950s area of study, it's not, again, something that I've particularly looked into. I'm sure maybe in the comments people can let us know some additional examples, but one example I do definitely know is that a lot of the early tracking systems, optical tracking systems for rocket launches, that is, space rocket launches for NASA, the systems that allowed either telescopes as of the more optical kind or cameras to track the rockets as they took off and headed up into the sky were actually directly adapted from systems from US Navy destroyers, which were used to track enemy aircraft as part of the spotting system for the fire control directors, because that was pretty much the only system that had the stability and fidelity and speed to reliably, essentially lock onto a subject and keep tracking it as its rate and bearing changed across the sky. Now, obviously, the rockets were moving considerably faster than Japanese Zero or Kate or whatever, but because they were considerably further away, the rate of change in terms of angle of bearing per second was not actually that dissimilar. So when you see a lot of footage, especially early footage, and who knows, maybe they're still using it, of things like early Delta rockets or Titans or Saturn V's heading off into the sky, and you think, oh, how are they keeping track of the rocket from launch all the way until it's reaching the edge of the atmosphere and keeping the whole thing centered? Well, there's a core of anti-aircraft tracking system from an old US Navy warship built into that. Richard Shue asks, in the process of scrapping a warship, it seems to be common practice to have scrapyards bid for the right to scrap that warship. Was it common for foreign scrapyards to bid on scrapping a warship that did not serve in said foreign shipyards nations? And were there any ironic or notable instances of ships scrapped in a nation that the ships previously fought against? There are a few examples, but most of them are rather conditional. So, for example, a good chunk of the German High Seas Fleet was scrapped in British shipyards, but that's because they scuttled themselves in Scapa Flow, and those happened to be the nearest shipyards available. Some of the wrecks of the High Seas Fleet did end up going to European yards. In fact, a few even ended up going back to German yards, but most of them went to British yards. And then, of course, obviously, you have some ships that were originally part of one nation's navy, then the war's over, especially after World War II, and they're transferred to another nation's navy that had previously been not on the same side, and when they reach their end of life, sometimes they are scrapped in what's now their home nation's yards, even though they previously fought against whatever nation had originally gifted them the ship. For example, at least one of the Fletcher class that was then given to what became the West German Navy was then subsequently scrapped by the West German Navy, then, despite obviously the Fletchers having been built at a time when Germany was at war with the US. But in terms of, at least in the time that the channel covers, foreign scrapyards bidding on scrapping a warship that didn't serve in that nation's navy, that was much less common than it is today. Partly because, back then, just having to pay the costs to tow the thing across the ocean would eat pretty much all of your profit margin, if not more. And also, again, for the most part back then, a lot of who a navy was prepared to send a ship to be broken up by depended on how recent that ship was. If there was a chance that ship still had sensitive technology or design secrets aboard, then obviously the navy would want that ship to be broken up locally. And on that, yes, obviously they could take some systems off, but some stuff is fairly integral to the ship. Whereas perhaps if you're scrapping a bunch of really old school stuff like Fisher's Drive to get rid of a bunch of ironclads in the 1900s, those ships, no one's going to be deriving any particular interesting knowledge from an 1868 ironclad in 1905. So something like that could reasonably be sold off to a foreign shipyard if they really wanted to break it up. And of course, in Europe, that's much easier to do because the journey from, let's say, Portsmouth to somewhere in Germany or somewhere in France might actually be shorter than the journey from Portsmouth to some of the more northern UK yards. Lord Quack, King of the Ducks, asks, I recently reread the excellent Shattered Sword book, and one thing that struck me was the section where the authors described how cramped the island of Akagi was with Nagumo His staff, Captain Aoki, and his staff, plus the normal operational crew members, all piled inside. This cramped nature and the lack of a private area for Nagumo to consult with his staff is mentioned as a potential reason for some of the choices made during the Battle of Midway. Looking at the Japanese carriers, it seems like they stuck with very small islands much longer than the US and UK did. From pictures I found, it doesn't seem like the Japanese got a carrier with an island of comparable size to the US or UK until Taiho. Akagi and Kaga are understandable since they're conversions and early experiments, but even the Shikakus have much smaller islands than the Yorktowns or Illustriouses, even though they are contemporary. So why did the Japanese stick with such relatively small islands so late, when it seems the US and UK had figured out you needed to have more space for effective command of the ship, the air group, and maybe even a fleet if you have an admiral on board? Was it a doctrinal difference, institutional stubbornness, or some other reason? Believe it or not, it's mostly to do with a completely different engineering design choice, which is what you do with the smoke and hot gases from the ship's boilers. Because, as you can see in this picture of Shikaku, for the bulk of the Japanese fleet carrier program, if you like, the ships that made up the classic Bikido Butai, pretty much in all cases, their exhausts are being vented out and over the side in some way, shape, or form by means of these sideways and downwards pointing trunks. If you look at Saratoga, Ark Royal, the Illustriouses, the Yorktowns, etc., all of them have the funnel built, or funnels, built into the island. And that, in and of itself, actually significantly enhances the apparent size of the island, especially on the Lexingtons. But if you look, for example, at especially something like Ark Royal, and to a lesser extent the Yorktowns, if you look at a side profile picture, much like you have here of Shikaku, and you try to mentally erase the funnel, or funnels, depending on the ship, from the equation, you'll suddenly realize that actually the island structure is not that much larger than the island structure on something like a Shikaku or Hiryu, for example. It is a little bit larger, but there is something of a related lesson to this, and that is that if you decide you are putting the funnels or the trunking immediately adjacent to your island and you're incorporating the two into a single structure rather than venting out to the side, which the Japanese wanted to do to reduce interference across their flight decks, well, once you've got these rather large aerodynamically interfering structures there, and the hot gases potentially from the funnels, well, you might as well make use of the space. And also, it's not just might as well, engineering-wise, you pretty much have to, because if you have a small island in front of some big funnels, you're going to have a whole load of air vortexes coming off of the island, then immediately slamming into the funnels, which is going to create all sorts of horrific aerodynamic effects further aft. Whereas if you kind of pair the two together, which increases the overall size of your island, it's still not great from an aerodynamically disruptive effect prospect, but it is better than having standalone structures in very close proximity. And once you've enhanced the volume of the island, well, then you might as well make use of the volume of that island. And once you realize how useful that volume is, then you're more likely to incorporate it into future designs, and so on and so forth. Whereas for the Japanese, they placed a huge amount of emphasis on clearing the deck of any and all turbulence, and once you've gone with this side-mounted funnel option, if you like, well, if all you've got left is the island for command and control facilities, then if that is your sole major disruptive aerodynamic feature above the flight deck, suddenly you're driven to try and minimize that to reduce turbulence as well. And you end up with the situation the Japanese were in. Notably, if you look at Taiho, look where her funnel is. It's straight up in the manner of British and American carriers. The Judge 2017 asks, the B-52 Stratofortress has been in service for over 70 years, with the most recent deliveries being 60 years old and plans for them to serve for many more years. What are some examples of warships that went on to serve for a lot longer than expected? Well, Victory and Constitution are the easy low-hanging fruit, because obviously they've technically been in service in commission for more than 200 years each, which is, considerably beyond their expected lifespan. But granted, most of that has not been in active service. But actually, even in active service, victory does count, because there was serious thought given to breaking her up towards the end of the 18th and beginning of the 19th century, because she was pretty old even by then, but instead they decided to give her a great repair. And then, of course, she went on to fight at Trafalgar, and even though she was quite badly beaten up by that, she'd won so much fame that she was then kept around in service, for that matter, although with a brief stint as not in service, but she was still in service for considerably longer than she had any right to be, and then, of course, went on to be kind of a preserved ship more than anything else. You, of course, have the Parnaíba, the Brazilian river monitor that's still trucking along quite merrily. The poor old Russian repair ship Kommuna is now over a century old and still apparently just about dodging being sunk. And in terms of active frontline warships, I think probably in terms of relative expected lifespan to actual lifespan, the prize probably has to go by a very, very long way to the 1942 design light fleet carriers, aka the Colossuses and Majestics, because whereas all the other warships we've just mentioned were expected to serve for 20, 30, maybe 40 years and then get scrapped, but have continued on considerably past that in various ways, shapes and forms, the original concept for the Colossuses and Majestics was literally for them to only last maybe 3-4 years at the most, and then either be discarded or combat damage would have done for them anyway. And yet somehow they've become became, because there aren't any of them left any now, but they became some of the single longest serving warships in 20th century history. So particular prizes obviously have to go to the ex-HMS Vengeance and HMS Hercules, both of which were started during the Second World War, both of which were launched prior to the end of 1945. And, of course, Vengeance went on to serve in the Royal Australian Navy and then in the Brazilian Navy as Minas Gerais, and she was only taken out of service and scrapped in the 21st century. So, more than 60 years of active service, or just about pushing 60 years of active service, which isn't bad for a ship that was meant to last, 1/20th of that. And then, of course, Hercules, although launched around the same time as Vengeance, not actually commissioned for quite a long time thereafter, but then eventually ended up in Indian Navy service as Vikrant, and she was only scrapped, admittedly having come out of service a little bit earlier than that, but she was only scrapped less than 10 years ago. Again, not a bad run for a ship that was supposed to have been scrapped before 1950. HMS Implosive asks, let's say a navy wants to build a fleet of dreadnoughts. Are they better off building a few big ships with many guns or more ships with less guns? Or to put it another way, is a navy going to be more happy with 4 9-gun ships or 3 12-gun ships, considering tactical, strategic and economic implications? Now that's a good question. That's something that has been bedeviling various navies for a very long time. Do you go with the gold-plated top-of-the-range option, even though you can get fewer of them, or do you go with the slightly more numerous, easier-to-produce option? My personal feeling, based on my analysis of various navies' histories, is that assuming that your guns are capable of doing a reasonable amount of damage to contemporary enemies, then the larger the navy, the better it is to go with the slightly fewer number of guns but more ships, and the smaller the navy, the more firepower you want to pack into individual ships. Now, you can argue, of course, that perhaps the navy will be so large that it can afford to build both lots of ships and ships with very heavy firepower, like, for example, the Royal Navy immediately pre-World War I with the Queen Elizabeths. And yes, that is a valid argument if you happen to have an absurd advantage over everybody else. However, in more general terms, if you're talking about a large navy typically will want to operate its capital ships in squadrons, and most navies tended to settle on a squadron size of 4, or at least if they're or at least maybe a half division size of 4, so the basic fleet unit being 4 ships, where they had a choice. And in that case, if your choice is, well, we can get 4 ships with 9 decent guns, or we can have 3 ships with 12 decent guns, most of the larger navies would prefer to go with the 4 9-gun ships because it gives them more ships overall. And I suspect these numbers were chosen very specifically by the questioner, because you'll notice both options give you 36 guns afloat. But for the larger navy, more ships splitting those guns between them potentially means that for a given amount of money you can get more armor and or perhaps more speed onto those 9-gun ships, and those ships can be in more places at once, which is also a useful feature. And of course, should one of your ships be lost, you've only lost a quarter of that unit's firepower, as opposed to if you have 3 12-gun ships and one of those ships is lost, you've lost a third of that section's firepower. And because, of course, if you're going to build a 12-gun ship, if you want to have the same amount of armor and the same speed as the 9-gun ship, it's going to be considerably larger and more expensive. However, when you are a smaller navy, the whole equation turns on its head, because if you have, say, an hypothetical large fleet or multiple large fleets from different nations that can build 20 or 30 ships, and they're building 9-gun ships, and you're a small navy and you can only build 4 ships, well, building 4 9-gun ships isn't going to really help you all that much, because assuming they're of roughly the same capacity and capability as the bigger navy ships, well, the bigger navy can just straight up massively outnumber you and turn up with, say, 2 squadrons, and then you're stuffed. Whereas if at that point you go with spending roughly the same money on 3 12-gun ships, well, individually those 12-gun ships should, in theory, be capable of defeating 3 9-gun ships, and potentially, if they can do it quickly enough, potentially even defeating 4 9-gun ships. But for the larger navy, building massive numbers of those 12-gun ships would be ruinously expensive. For you as a small nation, you maybe have to put a little bit more money out, but because you're only building 3 or 4 of them, it's a lot of money for 3 or 4 ships, but it is a finite amount of money overall, and it forces your opponent to, well, if they're a really big navy, they might still come after you, but they're going to have to devote considerably more resources to coming after you than if you had a fleet of ships that was contemporary with capability with their own. And that might make them think twice, not because they can't crush you, but because of what it would cost them to crush you and where that would leave them compared to other large navies that perhaps they don't want to tangle with from a position of weakness. Kind of like when you look at the Sverigers. The Sverigers on their own, nowhere near comparable with the Scharnhorsts. But they had just enough firepower when backed up by the Swedish coast defence system that when the Kriegsmarine looked at them, they went, yeah, we could win, but it would cost us too much, so we won't go after them. So yeah, even though individually any element up to and including the Sverigers of the Swedish coastal defence system was in no way, shape or form capable of taking on the German fleet, simply by going for the really expensive option, at least as far as coast defence battleships went, they were able to scare them off. At least in the wider global context of, the Germans also being at war with Britain. Michael Gilson asks, the USS Schmidt DE-676 and later APD-76 was named for the chaplain of USS Oklahoma. In 1969, she was transferred to the Republic of China Navy, where she served until she was scrapped in 1976. 76 showing up quite a lot in this. If interested and wealthy people had purchased the Schmidt then, could she have been brought to, I think that's Dubuque, maybe, Iowa, where Father Schmidt's remains were later interred once they were finally identified, and set up as a museum? Probably not a floating museum, though. According to Wikipedia, a fully loaded Buckley class drew 11 feet, and the Mississippi at that place is deeper than that only part of the year, and Buckley's were 306 foot long, Mississippi locks are 600 foot long. Yes, in theory, I think that could have been possible. For one thing, obviously, once you've got hold of the ship in its decommissioned state, there are going to be a number of things that you can do or would have been done to lighten the ship. For example, it's not going to be carrying any ammunition. It's not going to be carrying a full crew. It's not going to be carrying fuel. Certainly, well, I mean, you might have fuel to sail it across back to the US, but for going up the Mississippi, for example, you could completely defuel it. All of those, and stores as well, all of those things are going to lighten the ship and thus reduce its draft. There are a few other things you might be able to do as well, such as perhaps removing the lighter weapons and sending them on of a like fire truck or something like that, getting them restored on the way, and various other things like the ship's boats and stuff. I mean, none of those things individually add up to much weight, but collectively you could actually be saving a few hundred tons, which is going to add up quite a bit on a ship of the displacement of a Buckley-class destroyer escort. And of course, yeah, as I say, all of this is going to reduce the draft. You could then tow it up the Mississippi quite reasonably. Obviously, you'd have to time it for the height of the river, not just at your home location, but also all the way along the river from the Caribbean all the way up to that location. Potentially, I mean, given if you've got a lot of money and this is a one-off thing, you could also even try cameling the ship if some parts of the river seem to be running a little bit shallow, which you'll recall from the first half of this particular dry dock is the practice of essentially just strapping a bunch of barges on next to the ship when the barges are heavily loaded, and then unloading it, usually just water pump it out as the barges rise. That also brings the ship up a little bit, although whether or not you could get a camelled destroyer escort through the locks widthwise would be a completely separate question. But yeah, I think getting the ship up there in one go is probably viable if you've got the money and the resources to throw at the situation. But then once it's up there, as you said, because of the changing levels of the Mississippi, you probably at that point want to just get some land, hire a backhoe, spend a week digging a massive hole, bring the ship into said massive hole, and then fill it back in again. And then hopefully it'll stay nice and stable and in place. Hearn asks, at the time of Bismarck's breakout in 1941, the newest US battleship was USS North Carolina, with the immediately preceding ships being the 1920s vintage Colorado class. Unless I'm very much mistaken, the US didn't have any battleships with the speed to catch Bismarck. With that said, in some bizarre alternate timeline where the US Navy decided they were going to hunt down Bismarck for whatever reason, would it even have been possible if they had managed somehow to intercept Bismarck with, say, a Colorado or any other US Navy battleship and a brand new North Carolina? Then what would the outcome have been? This is actually a very interesting period of history for the US Navy because, as you mentioned, they don't have anything other than North Carolina, and she's barely a month into commission at this point. She would, of course, have a very extensive sea trials period while they were trying to figure out what was going on with the resonance that was causing her to vibrate at high speeds, which is another problem because although she's not fast enough to catch Bismarck, she is still a fast battleship, except for the fact that when she goes at top speed in May 1941, she's going to be vibrating like anything. But she can at least transit a little bit faster than your standard class and with reasonable fuel economy. Now, outside of that, the US does have a reasonable number of ships in the Atlantic because they're doing neutrality patrols. So there's a range of destroyers, mostly older Clemson and Wicks class, but some of the newer ones as well. There's a variety of different cruisers of varying capabilities, although, of course, none of the US cruisers that are operational in this area have torpedoes. And then you also have older battleships, New York, Texas, Arkansas, etc. Let's face it, you really don't want to put one of those up against Bismarck, on their own. However, they do have one rather interesting asset, which is, of course, USS Ranger. At this point, she is on neutrality patrols in the Atlantic, so she has her air group to hand. But, of course, this is prior to her being retrofitted with torpedo bombers, so she doesn't actually have any torpedo bombers aboard. She has a single squadron of Wildcats and a fairly large number of SB-2U Vindicators, the older monoplane dive bomber, the one that precedes the Dauntless. So no torpedoes to hunt Bismarck down with, unless the destroyers happen to get lucky, but a fairly large number of dive bombers. But although they're carrying some fairly hefty bombs, let's face it, those dive bombers are very unlikely to score the kind of mission kill on Bismarck that the Swordfish would by putting torpedoes into Bismarck's stern. Although with that said, the sheer number of dive bombers, Bismarck's fairly lackluster anti-aircraft performance, and the explosive power of some of the heavy bombs they can carry means that although you're not going to cripple its steering, hits to the bow and stern, or even also near misses, could potentially open up enough parts of the ship and cause enough flooding to force the ship to slow down a reasonable amount anyway. And the single biggest asset I think the US Navy is going to have in this scenario is its range. Because as we know historically, the British ships that showed up and would eventually catch and kill Bismarck, a lot of them had to break off later in the day during the engagement because they were running out of fuel. The US Navy ships, assuming that they've got a reasonable amount of fuel aboard at the time the search begins, are going to be far less vulnerable to that. So if you have a hypothetical scenario where one or more of the US cruisers is tracking Bismarck in much the same way that Norfolk and Suffolk did, then potentially Ranger isn't as fast as Bismarck, but Bismarck's not going to be booking it at 30 knots in all directions. If Ranger can get into a launch position and start hitting Bismarck with dive bombers, and maybe even strafing it with Wildcats, then there is a decent chance that Ranger can pace Bismarck, with obviously guidance from the cruisers, and keep hitting her with repeated dive bomber strikes, because outside of shooting down the odd Vindicator, there's not a huge amount Bismarck can really do about that. There is, of course, the possibility that Bismarck might decide, okay, where are these aircraft coming from? Let's go over there and see if we can find the carrier and kill it. But, well, if you're being guided in by the US cruisers that are shadowing Bismarck, you don't even necessarily have to fly in a direct line from Ranger. In fact, what would be a really good idea would be to fly from Ranger to the US cruisers, and then the US cruisers can go, hey, it's over there, kind of like the way that Ark Royal's Swordfish did the second time after their first accidental attack on Sheffield, which then doesn't really give Bismarck much to go on, because if she turns around and goes in the direction the aircraft are coming from, well, that's the direction of the US cruisers, so that doesn't tell her anything about where Ranger is. North Carolina, though, would be able to, in theory, close down, because Bismarck would be taking twists and turns to try and break off contact with the cruisers and try and shake off air attacks from Ranger. So, A, she's not going to be going tremendously fast, and she's not going to be going in a straight line, whereas North Carolina can go in a straight line to establish an interception position. I mean, after all, King George V and Rodney also were not fast enough in a straight line chase to catch Bismarck, but they still managed it, albeit after Bismarck was slowed down, but they were in the right interception position, approximately speaking, at least until King George V went herring off. Rodney did actually stay in roughly the right area. Now, of course, if you have multiple battleships in the area, why not take multiple battleships? Because, fair fights aren't how you win wars. So you could potentially detach one of the other older neutrality patrol battleships or more to come and kind of try and catch and kill Bismarck. But that, with the speed restrictions, probably does rely to a certain extent on a lucky positioning. So, if one of those battleships is in the Eastern Atlantic, they can chart a relatively short course to block Bismarck's approach to France. Whereas if they're in the Western Atlantic, chances are they're probably not going to be able to catch up in time. So the most likely scenario in this kind of theoretical scenario is probably North Carolina having to deal with Bismarck solo, or maybe backed up by US destroyers and cruisers, rather than necessarily having another battleship to hand, after Bismarck has been tracked and hit repeatedly from Ranger. So Bismarck will be at a slight disadvantage in that she'll have a bunch of damage already, which will slow her down, might even have destroyed some of her fire or damaged some of her fire control equipment. North Carolina, on the other hand, won't be able to proceed at full speed because, well, she can, but then she won't be able to fire because the vibration issues will ruin her fire control solutions. But she can still proceed at, like, the mid-20s of knots. She has got a fair bit of firepower. However, she is just out of commissioning, or having just been commissioned, so her crew, in theory, is not particularly that experienced, albeit, at the same time, Massachusetts gun crews were not, in theory, that experienced when they went into the Battle of Casablanca, and they did pretty well for themselves. So, while it is a theoretical mark against, it's not necessarily saying that North Carolina's gunnery crews will be completely terrible. There's every chance they might get a fairly decent set of salvos off, and of course they do have a pretty good fire control system backing them up. So as long as they can either use the basic radar set of 1941 North Carolina or just the optical systems to get, decent data on the range and course and speed of Bismarck, there's a reasonable chance they can start hitting Bismarck pretty hard. 16-inch 45 caliber guns will tend to do that. Obviously, North Carolina's armor is not fantastic against Bismarck's 15-inch guns, and a lot of it, I think, is going to come down to who hits first, but North Carolina will have an advantage in her favour, and of course, as we said, Bismarck will have been somewhat reduced by Ranger's dive bombing. And as long as Bismarck doesn't hit North Carolina in the early stages of the engagement in somewhere particularly vital, I think as time goes on, especially if Ranger is continuing her air attacks, the starting point of having already been damaged and then cumulative damage coming in from North Carolina hitting her, and possibly also the US cruisers joining in, much the same way that Dorsetshire did, for example, all of this will probably collectively put Bismarck down. And again, because of the range that US ships are capable of, again, assuming they have a reasonable amount of fuel when the search starts, there is also a reasonable chance that the US destroyers will be launching, either as a coup de grace or potentially actually during the battle itself, launching torpedo salvos at Bismarck, although how many of those torpedoes will actually function properly is another matter. But there's a lot more variables involved in the outcome, because at the end of the day, the US can draw upon immediately one carrier and one fast battleship and a small selection of destroyers and cruisers, whereas obviously the British could draw on many cruisers, some destroyers, and quite a few capital ships and at least 2 carriers, which statistically meant that if any one of them didn't achieve something or lost Bismarck, there was other stuff to take up the slack. Whereas while there is a plausible scenario in which the US Navy would be able to catch and kill Bismarck, it relies on a much more linear chain of events, and there are a few reasonably plausible scenarios which could derail all that and let Bismarck get away scot-free. Fechtler, I apologise, but as you can probably hear by this stage, my voice is beginning to get a bit scratchy, so forgive me for not pronouncing your full username this time around. But he asks, in the interwar period, France seems to have come close to coming down with a bad case of socialism in either the nationalist or communist strains. Considering the threat of a current ally suddenly allying itself with a hostile continental nation, did the Royal Navy have any campaign plans for a war with France during this time? And if they did these plans prove useful when France fell in the Second World War? The answer is kind of and maybe. So if you look through Admiral Cunningham's biography and also the accounts of Admiral Backhouse, basically the people who were immediately prior to the Second World War in charge of planning for the Royal Navy, they discovered that the general war plans that the Royal Navy had, at least the modern ones, were very thin on the ground in terms of overall specific detail. There weren't comprehensive volumes that sort of went, in the event of war with country X, we will do X, Y, and Z, targeting their fleet here, here, and here with these ships and blockading these ports. Now, granted, everybody has a degree of flexibility, but going into the Second World War, as I've mentioned before on the channel, because Britain had to theoretically think about going to war with almost anybody, Japan, Italy, Germany, potentially even the US, France, or Russia, or any combination thereof, trying to write comprehensive war plans for every possible permutation of who Britain would be fighting, well, that way lay madness. Now, granted, the US did have war plans for fighting quite a lot of different countries, but, well, the war plan for fighting the Japanese War Plan Orange was somewhat more comprehensive than some of the others. But Britain, as far as I can tell from my research, seems to have mostly relied on, again, as I mentioned before, a series of training exercises and situations which essentially break down the conduct of war into its constituent components. Convoy chases, convoy defense, fleet battles, blockade, submarine campaigns, and so on and so forth. And essentially given the captains, and so to a degree the admirals of the Royal Navy, a kind of a grab bag of experience and tools from which to draw, at which point I guess their theory was, well, when it looks like the hostilities are about to arise, we will then know roughly who we're going to be fighting, at which point we can take our building blocks and take a look at the enemy coastline and fleet deployments and quickly put together an outline plan, which we will then try and execute. And I suspect if there was a war with France, I mean, there would have been some small brief about just in case France goes completely nuts and we end up back at war with them for, what, the 97th time, then they would be able to deal with those. But there wasn't anything as advanced as a specific step-by-step how to demolish the Marine Nationale and blockade France plan, because it was generally held that any such plan probably wouldn't be worth utilising anyway, because circumstances would change very quickly. Pedden Harley asks, I recently visited the Sloop of War Constellation in Baltimore Harbour. The museum describes Constellation as the last sail-only warship designed and built for the US Navy. Constellation would see active service during the American Civil War as a sail-only vessel. For comparison, when did the Royal Navy cease ordering sail-only ships, and when did the Royal Navy cease operating sail-only ships as active cruising warships, as opposed to sail training vessels for cadets? Was the Crimean War the last occasion when sail-only Royal Navy ships saw action? In terms of major action, yes, the Crimean War would pretty much be the last major conflict that saw substantial Royal Navy warships operating under sail only. In terms of when the Royal Navy stopped ordering sail-only ships, into, at least in the major warships category, that appears to be the very end of the 1840s. The last sailing ships of the line, the last sailing frigates, and even the last sailing corvettes and sloops all seem to have been ordered in 1848 or 1849, a number of which would then be converted on the stocks into paddle or screw ships. Some of them would be launched as sailing-only ships, HMS Phaeton here being one of the very last, for example, Royal Navy sailing frigates from the very late 1840s. But the vast majority of these smaller craft either tended to be out of service within 15, 20 years, if that, or if they had a longer life expectancy, or they were larger vessels like the ships of the line, they were converted to screw ships, usually at some point in the 1850s, some of them in the very, very early 1860s. Phaeton, for example, right at the end of the 1850s, was given an auxiliary steam plant. So, yeah, the last orders, end of the 1840s. In terms of ceasing to operate sail-only ships as active cruising ships, i.e. active frontline warships, I strongly suspect that by the early 1860s, and certainly by the mid-1860s, pretty much any Royal Navy substantial warship you came across would at least have steam auxiliary power of some description, or would be imminently about to receive it, or be scrapped. Gottjäger asks, how did Henry V's navy work, and how, if at all, did it differ from common practice? It's my understanding that in the period, navies were pretty much raised as needed. So how did you get your ships in the correct place at the correct time? So Henry V's navy specifically was actually a little bit different to most other medieval navies. For big expeditions, it was still a relatively small fleet. It couldn't transport any substantial number of troops if you're going to go and invade France or something like that. So in terms of general wartime, it was pretty much as almost all navies would be, both before, during, and after that time period, all the way up to and including, for example, the Elizabethan era. So it was the personal property of the monarch, and as and when there was something very dramatic happening, like a war with France in this case, then it would be brought out and it would be supplemented by a considerably larger fleet of privately owned vessels. Some of them would be foreign, most of them would be English, and they would be variously either be hired or they would be provided by various organisations like the City of London as part of their feudal obligations to the king, or they might just be commandeered by the king as well. So, for example, in the run-up to the campaign that would lead to the Battle of Agincourt, the Admiral of England, who at that point was Thomas, Earl of Dorset, was given an order by the king, and I quote, to cause all ships, barges, ballingers, and other vessels of England to be at the port of Southampton by the 8th of May. So at that point, if you owned a ship that was capable of crossing the Channel, no matter how big it was, if you were in an English port, you were going to Southampton, whether you liked it or not. And shortly thereafter, presumably, there was some resistance to this, because about, 3-4 months after that order went out, 2 men were sent up and down the country, and they were ordered to seize all ships and other vessels of the realm and foreign parts of the portage of 20 tons and more in the port of London, and take them to the port of Southampton with all possible speed to serve the king on his present voyage. So that's how you get hundreds and hundreds of ships to transport 15,000 plus men, plus all their supplies and siege equipment, animals, etc. over the Channel to France. However, that's fairly typical of the time. And as I said, you just literally tell people, hey, you go to there, you do this job for the king. The implication being, or else. It's a fairly small world. We know where you are. We will come for you after otherwise. But in more day-to-day practice, Henry V's navy specifically was unusual compared to a lot of other navies of the period, because he actually took quite an interest in the navy. He built it up from a handful to shades of Henry VII and Henry VIII here, to over 30 warships, and these were much more explicitly designed as warships as compared to a lot of vessels at the time, which could be both, depending on the circumstances. And he actually had captains on a salary and a certain number of other specialist officers, again, fully commissioned full-time. And the navy in his period was actually quite active. So even with Henry VIII, for example, he would bring his navy out for transporting to the field of cloth or gold, or for a particular war with France or whatever. But then they would also spend extended periods in dock, just not really doing all that much. Henry V was different. He actually kept his fleet at sea for a good portion of his reign. Now, granted, there weren't too many battles with the French, because the French generally tended to stay away from him. But the main purpose of the English fleet at that point was to patrol the Channel and the North Sea to try and keep it clear of pirates, because pirates were actually quite endemic to the area. And Henry essentially took the view, this is Henry V, that the amount it cost him to build these warships and man them and have their captains and everything and pay for them to patrol regularly up and down English waters, yes, that was a cost to his treasury, but it would be more than made up for in the increase in trade and the lack of losses in trade, because, of course, the more merchant ships that enter English ports, the more ships that can be taxed, and that tax comes straight back to Henry, and the more trade that's going on in the country, the more wealth the country has, which, of course, can also be taxed, and therefore, net, it should result in an overall win for his finances, and, of course, increase his popularity with the traders and so forth, because, well, it's better to pay a percentage tax to the king when you make a safe voyage than to pay a 100% tax to pirates when they take your stuff and possibly chuck you overboard. Nathan P. Gillespie asks, one of the things that my dad did as a Marine in Korea was as a forward observer. He told me about spotting for USS Iowa, and as we're Iowans, that was special. For the Royal Navy, who normally did the spotting? Was it Royal Marines, Royal Navy officers, regular Army guys, and did it depend on the era? Very much dependent on the era, and even within a given era, very much dependent on circumstance. So, for example, during the landings in Normandy, HMS Belfast had the previous year been refitted and no longer carried aircraft, whereas before she perhaps could have been expected to use her aircraft as a spotter, except for the fact that during Operation Overlord specifically, there was so much air traffic that the ships were generally ordered not to use their spotting aircraft, essentially to avoid confusion and potential friendly fire incidents, and they were instead supplied with specific observation officers or sometimes observation aircraft from other services. But in other circumstances, perhaps earlier in the Second World War, in a slightly less congested environment, if you were doing short bombardment, then you would use your own spotting aircraft, hence why there's a picture of a Sea Fox here. As along with the Walrus and the floatplane Swordfish, this was one of several different seaplanes or floatplanes in service on board Royal Navy ships at the beginning of the Second World War. And obviously this kind of spotting was very much to your advantage if you were bombarding a target in enemy-held territory and there wasn't a substantial presence of troops on the ground. If, however, there was a substantial presence of troops on the ground, such as the D-Day landings or thereafter, then your forward observer, your forward spotter on land, could be almost anyone. As I said, there were some specifically assigned both pilots and observers and ground-based men for the D-Day operations themselves, but as time went forward and the Allied armies were progressing along the northern coast of France, quite a number of ships were directly linked into multiple units who were on the front lines, at which point you might receive a request for fire support from any number of forward spotters who may be from all sorts of different services, and if the ship was in that particular sector, then they would just say, well, we are here, so you look at your map, okay, they're there. We think the enemy is over here, okay, they are over there. We as the ship are over here, which means we should be firing thus. And then the forward observer would say, okay, that either that was on target or bit short, bit long, etc., etc. And yeah, that could be regular army officers, it could be an embedded Navy officer or an embedded Marine. It's incredibly variable. Robert Knapp asks, on one of their cruises, Scharnhorst and Gneisenau had to turn away from several convoys due to old battleships as escorts. What do you think would happen if they'd decided to force the issue? Rodney seems obvious, but would Malaya or a Royal Sovereign type have dealt with them? It's a very interesting question, actually, because the reason for the German ships' orders not to engage those capital ships wasn't necessarily because they didn't believe they couldn't beat those ships. It was a little bit of an open question. It was more the fact of what state would the ships be in afterwards. Because if you assumed that Malaya or Ramillies or whoever was at least captained vaguely competently, which is, the general assumption you make in wartime, then you have to take into account that, yes, the Scharnhorsts have a range advantage, and for what that's worth, and yes, obviously they are considerably faster, but unlike a lot of circumstances, the speed advantage doesn't make too much odds, because the objective that the Scharnhorsts have to get is the convoy, and so all the old battleship has to do is put itself between the convoy and the ships, and because it's therefore got a massively shorter inside track, it can essentially keep itself between the ships and the convoy, and therefore you have to go through it. And if you withdraw, well, that's perfectly fine from a convoy escorting point of view, so there's no point in pursuing. And then it just comes down to guns and armour, and obviously, even though they're somewhat older guns, the 15-inch armament of the R-types and the Queen Elizabeths, it will hit very hard, as was actually obviously proven when Renown hit hit the ships in the action off Lofoten. So the Germans know roughly what 15-inch shell hits will most likely do to their ships, and they are aware that as good as the German 11-inch gun, the one on the Scharnhorsts at least, is, it is still an 11-inch gun, and the Queen Elizabeths and the R's are built to take considerably heavier firepower in terms of being hit by peer weapons, i.e. 15-inch shells. So, although obviously there is the whole thing of, hits outside the citadel and away from the turrets, which may partially incapacitate the ship, the same is true going the other way, except that obviously the 15-inch shell hitting harder is potentially able to do more damage over wider areas, and a single hit will result in more damage, period. Whereas direct hits to the protection of Malaya or Ramillies, unless you get really, really close, are relatively unlikely to do all that much. So even if you manage to overcome one of these ships, it is very, very likely that they will have landed quite a few hits on you as well. And even assuming in a best case scenario that hasn't completely crippled or sunk one or the other ship, so they're both still intact, just a bit battered, by the time you've managed to finally put Malaya or Ramillies down, you're going to be in a situation where you've taken some fairly critical damage, you've been pinned in place for potentially several hours, and everybody and their dog in that convoy will have been telling everyone in the vicinity who you are, where you are, and what you're doing. Which means that you are quite likely not going to be able to proceed at full speed because of damage. You will be in a substantially worse off position to fight if you have to give another fight, and the more mobile forces that the Royal Navy has in and around the area are now gunning for you, and they're probably bigger and nastier, like Rodney, for example. And so you might win that first battle, but you will almost certainly lose the next one, and you won't be able to get home in time. Absolute best case scenario, you're damaged and you have to cut the cruise short and hightail it for France, and maybe you make it there. But if you do, now the voyage is over, and what have you accomplished? Well, yes, you've sunk an old battleship, potentially, great, but sinking an old battleship doesn't stop Britain's trade. Sinking convoys stops Britain's trade, and at most you'll have managed to sink some ships from that convoy, because while you're in the process of gradually working down the old battleship, that convoy will have been scattering. So it was held better, preserve the ships, and just find ships that aren't escorted by battleships, and hopefully then you can get lots and lots of merchant ships, which has a far more detrimental effect on Britain. And that's the best case scenario. As I say, worst case scenario is either you win, but then you get caught by Royal Navy forces homing in on you and you lose both the ships. And absolute worst case scenario is you try and fight, but Malaya or Ramillies or whoever you're engaging hits you first and or harder, so you have to break off, at which point you haven't sunk the ship, you haven't sunk the convoys, and you've got a bunch of smoking and blazing holes in you, which isn't brilliant. Brad in SoCal asks, the UK has held Gibraltar for some time now. The Strait of Gibraltar is about 8 miles across. Has holding that location historically been enough to prevent any nation's navy from transiting into or out of the Mediterranean? It seems much less a defensible choke point than the Bosphorus, for example. Yes, to a certain degree. So back when Britain first held it in the Age of Sail, it didn't stop people going into and out of the Mediterranean. Villeneuve's Toulon Squadron, for example, made the transit, but it did force them to make the transit in specific times, so usually trying to sneak through at night, because at 8 miles, cannon of that era couldn't cover the entirety of the straits, but obviously there were also ships based in Gibraltar, so if you tried to sail up to the straits during the daytime, then those ships could sortie and intercept you, whereas if you sailed up at night, obviously back in those days no radar, no night vision, etc., assuming it's a relatively dark night, not too much moonlight, etc., then obviously you could pass through, but it did restrict enemy movements. Once you get to the latter part of the 19th century and gun ranges start to increase, then it becomes much more of a definitive lockdown because, well, more guns start getting put in. Some guns even start getting put really high up on the Rock of Gibraltar, which you can see here. And now those guns can cover most of, and then later all of, the strait. And obviously optical spotting equipment's gotten better, and by World War II you also get radar. Now, of course, that doesn't necessarily stop U-boats from going through underwater, or Italian subs coming back the other way, but it does actually serve as quite a definitive stop on, especially in the Second World War, and to a certain extent even in the First, the progress of enemy shipping in and out. No one really tries to force it, but that's because they recognise that between the fortifications and the ship's base there, if you did try and force, unless you do it in massive strength, you're just going to end up losing a huge amount of ships. So you don't see any Kriegsmarine surface units, for example, transition from the Atlantic into the Mediterranean, and likewise Italian surface units don't transit from the Mediterranean out into the Atlantic. That traffic is entirely submarines, and even the submarines have a bit of a toll taken out of them. So, although no one's fully tested the defences of Gibraltar in that time period, the simple fact that nobody thought that they would commit suicide by testing them is pretty much a testament to how good the location is at actually controlling hostile access to and from the Mediterranean. JT Daily Update asks, I was wondering if you had any more detailed information on the testing and development of the W mines used during Operation Royal Marine. Yes, so actually this is a little pet subject of mine. So back near the beginning of the war, after various ships, obviously Allied ships, British ships, had been sunk, one of the ideas that was come up with was to drop mines into the Rhine. The problem is the Rhine is a river, and compared to the sea, it's not that deep. I mean, it's deep enough, but it's, compared to the actual sea and the oceans, it's nowhere near as deep. And dropping a few naval mines, therefore, possibly wouldn't work, and even if they did, it would be overkill. But the Rhine was a very vital industrial pathway, for transport of both raw materials and finished goods for the Germans. And so the idea was come up with, well, do we have some kind of small-scale submersible mine that we can drop en masse in the Rhine? And because obviously the Rhine is a river and flows, there was an additional idea of, well, if they're small enough and mobile enough, we could perhaps drop them in undefended portions of the Rhine, upstream of the major industrial areas where there'll be flak and fighters, and then they can all drift down with the river and smash into, small bridges and barges and all sorts of things and cause havoc. Of course, no such weapon existed at the time, so they decided to enlist the help of some of those madcap British scientists in sheds, and they invented one. But at this stage of the war, one of the major problems was, well, if you drop it into the Rhine upstream of German-held areas, fantastic, it'll blow up a bunch of German stuff, but the ones that don't hit German stuff will keep going, and then they'll enter areas of Europe that Germany at that point hadn't occupied, and they'll blow up their stuff, and those countries might not be too happy about it. So the rather ingenious invention was that when you drop the mine, not only would it arm itself once it was in the water, but it would also have a self-destruct fuse fitted, and that fuse was essentially prevented from detonating by an Alka-Seltzer tablet, because in testing they'd found that dissolved at a pretty regular rate. And so what they calculated is, well, if we drop them here, the tablet will take this amount of time to dissolve, and it'll take, based on the current speed of the Rhine, it should take about this long for the mines to drift from here to the edge of the Rhine area that the Germans now no longer control. And you match the two up, obviously adjust the thickness of the Alka-Seltzer tablet thusly, and so you now have a mine that is inert while it's in the aircraft. You drop it into the water, it arms itself, it starts merrily bobbing its way downstream just under the surface, hits a bunch of stuff and blows up. But if it drifts too far, doesn't hit anything, and is about to enter friendly territory, well, at that point the tablet has dissolved and the mine self-destructs, so it doesn't do any damage to your friendly people downstream. And it did actually seem to work for a while. Accounts are a little bit mixed. They were very small, so they weren't going to cause like colossal sea mine style damage. But then again, when you're talking about barges and rivercraft, you don't need to. But apparently it did cause a whole bunch of chaos because there were suddenly random explosions, putting holes in barges and pontoon bridges and damaging the foundation structures of regular bridges up and down the Rhine. And the Germans were very perplexed by this. And it did cause a bit of a seizure in river traffic for a bit. But, of course, the downside was eventually the mines just wash downstream and the threat goes away and things go back to normal. So in order for the campaign to actually work long term, you would have needed to constantly reseed the mines upstream and presumably hope that the Germans didn't come up with some kind of countermeasures like stringing a bunch of nets across the Rhine further up from their industrial areas or something like that once they realised what was going on. But as far as, a small compact weapon rushed into service and pretty much in a prototype stage almost until the very last minute, it did a reasonable job, but it then became too dangerous and too low impact to continue those missions once the main German offensive really got going and Western Europe, at least continental Western Europe, fell into German hands. Jack von Kern asks, for a service that took most of their inspiration and foundation from the Royal Navy, how did the Imperial Japanese Navy so badly screw up submarine and anti-submarine warfare? They are in a remarkably similar circumstance to the UK, entirely reliant on a maritime highway system to bring in the materials they need to survive, let alone make war, and they had to see how close the UK came to losing World War I from the U-boat menace. Why were they so willfully ignorant? There's a whole combination of factors. Part of it was that in the extremely screwed up and politicised version of Bushido that was gaining prominence in the late 1910s and then very much in the 20s and 30s, rear echelon duty, as it was seen for sub-hunting anti-submarine warfare, was nowhere near as glamorous and therefore less honourable compared to frontline destroyer, cruiser, battleship and carrier duty. And so the most aggressive and most career-focused minds in the Japanese Navy generally didn't want to go into it, either because they just flat out didn't think it was worth going into, or because even if they thought it might be important, it would essentially put their careers in a backwater. And so if you actually wanted to progress in the Japanese Navy, being in the anti-submarine hunting section was not the way to do it. And to a certain extent, the same was true of the submarine service. It wasn't seen as quite as low down the totem pole as the anti-submarine service. And obviously the big cruiser subs and stuff were supposed to have a fairly important mission, but the glory was in the battle line and in the battle fleet. Then you had the fact that obviously the whole Japanese Navy was configured around the Kantai Kessen, so everything had to be configured around that, and that included the submarine corps. And as we know from both World War I and World War II, whilst there are occasional successes, generally speaking, submarines in both world wars are much, much more effective against merchant shipping than they are against warships. And the Japanese submarine arm was largely configured to go after warships, so unsurprisingly their effectiveness was going to be somewhat lower than other submarine services that went after primarily merchant vessels. Then of course you have technological issues like the Japanese obviously not being quite as far advanced as the UK was in terms of ASDIC, later sonar. They had depth charges that just didn't go down deep enough. And also when you look at their tactics, they thought they were going to seize a massive perimeter, hold that perimeter, and then fight the decisive battle when the enemy tried to breach that perimeter, at which point, if the enemy's all the way over there, well, then surely their submarines can't get to all the way over here, the Japanese home islands and surrounding waters, and if they can't get over here, well, then why do we need to worry about submarines going after our merchant vessels? Because they physically won't be able to reach us, so everything will be fine, won't it? Plus, of course, the war was supposed to be a relatively short war. You have the short victorious campaign of expansion, the enemy tries to strike back, you sink their fleet, you force them to surrender, war is done, whereas submarine blockade, even at the most successful period of its time in 1917, is still a process that takes evidently years to work its way up to, And so, well, if you're not planning for the war to last years, you don't need to guard against a threat that will take years to actually significantly affect you. And then, of course, the other element is they're mainly focused on the US and the bulk of US merchant trade in the Pacific at that time. While there are obviously trade routes to Australia and so forth, the vast bulk of US flag shipping in the Pacific is in the Eastern Pacific or on the US West Coast. And that's so far away from Japan that although Japanese submarines can get there, given that they can only build a limited number of them, they'd prefer to have them hunting enemy warships instead, which kind of loops back on what we said previously. So it's a whole range of situational issues surrounding what they perceive to be their primary mission, plus this problem that they have of being very narrow-minded in terms of what is and is honourable service, and who should go in which branches of the military and which branches of the military should be particularly well funded. John Plate asks, in the age of sail, how would you become a ship's carpenter? 3 main routes. You might have carpentry skills on land, and if you then found yourself impressed into service, you could point out that you had said skills, and thus obviously become associated either with the existing ship's carpenter or assigned to that duty. Or if you've got the carpentry skills on land, you could volunteer your services and say, hey, look, I know carpentry, particularly obviously if you live near the coast, you might know specifically ship carpentry already from merchant service, or just helping out the locals. You might be a local as well, but fishing ships and stuff that came in. And then you volunteer to say, hey, look, I'd like to go to sea. I have carpentry skills. Great, fantastic. We need a ship's carpenter. Congratulations. And then potentially some degree of learning curve, or you might be assigned as a carpenter's mate. The other ways would be if you went aboard a ship as a ship's boy, and you were apprenticed to or requested to be apprenticed to the ship's carpenter. So he would then teach you the trade pretty much from the ground up, and then eventually you would either take over from him or move off to another ship with your own specific already pre-built set of expertise. Or you might be a late teen or early adult or something like that and have no carpentry skills whatsoever, but you're aboard a ship and you happen to get on relatively well with the ship's carpenter, at which point you may become a carpenter's mate, and just by helping out initially gain some experience, and then eventually by proving your capabilities you may be officially assigned to that position, at which point, pretty much like a boy apprentice, you would gradually learn the trade and eventually either take over or move off to another ship, depending on how old the existing ship's carpenter is and how long he stuck around. Al Sadius asks, limiting yourself to countries that were not part of the interwar treaty system, what ships do you most wish you could save to become museum ships? I think my top 3 picks for that would be Almirante La Torre from Chile, because then we'd actually have a battleship that fought at Jutland, to have a look at, which would be quite interesting. And of course, Almirante La Torre is very closely derived from the first generation British super dreadnoughts, so it would be kind of an insight into that era as well. Then I would go for Gorgon, aka Yavuz Sultan Selim, basically from, originally the Ottoman Empire, then Turkey, because, that ship, by the time it was scrapped, had a huge history behind it, and therefore would have been interesting in and of itself to preserve, plus all its shenanigans in the First World War, plus it would also then be the world's only preserved battle cruiser, which would be an interesting thing to have a look at. And I think probably third would be the Sverige, or her sisters, one of the Sveriges anyway, the Swedish coastal defence ships, because they are pretty much the epitome of coastal defence ship design, and it would have been really interesting to have one of them around to have a poke around on, because again, we don't have an example, or at least a big example of one of those left to us. My Mum's Basement Needs More Windows asks, the length of a large naval gun is expressed as a multiple of the gun's, or perhaps the projectile's, diameter. In my experience, the multiple is always an integer. Is there some law of physics or ballistics or ease of manufacture that makes this so? There's no particular law of physics that demands it, and indeed there are 1 or 2 guns that are described as, say, 35 or 40 caliber, when if you stick the bore length in inches and divide it through by the caliber, it's actually, half a caliber out of that, but it's rounded up or rounded down as appropriate. But you've also got to remember that when the bore is being rifled and the rifling is being cut, rifling is being done at a specific ratio. It's usually somewhere between 1 in 20 and 1 in 25. And at that point, if you have a rather precise length of the bore, then if you are cutting the rifling according to whatever ratio you're using, you can very easily calculate how many full turns that you are going to have to make. And ideally speaking, again, just from an ease of manufacturing perspective, you'd want to make either a set of full turns or a specifically known fraction thereof. So, for example, if you're doing a 40 caliber barrel and you're doing a 1 in 20 twist, then you have to go all the way around with the rifling machine twice. And if you do 1 in 22.5, well, that's exactly half of your 45 caliber barrel. 1 in 25 is exactly half of your 50 caliber barrel. So in all of the three of those cases, you can do exactly 2 twists. So it does make it a little bit easier to manufacture. But obviously that's not a universal rule, because you can find 40, 45, 50 caliber weapons or nearby thereof, which have twist ratios that aren't exactly half of the length of the barrel. But, some people like making life more difficult for themselves. Andre de Coult asks, after the deployment of magnetic influence detonators in mines, several navies started to develop torpedoes with such detonators, as far as I know with the intent for it to explode under the keel for maximum damage, but with varying degrees of success. After Norway, did the Germans improve their torpedo magnetic detonator or revert to contact detonations? And after the US fixed the Mark 14, were they using it with the magnetic detonator? For each one, if yes, when and where did they use them afterwards? And can you mention a couple of notable sinkings by torpedoes that detonated under the keel in World War II? And was there any protection for warships against under-keel detonating torpedoes? Yes, so the Germans did improve and fix their magnetic detonators in their torpedoes. It took them about 6 months before they were able to go back to using them properly, during which time obviously they were using contact detonators. And likewise with the Mark 14, well, as we saw in the video about that, it took them considerably longer to eventually fix most of those issues. But eventually, once the Mark 14 was largely fixed, it also would go back to using the magnetic detonator, although, of course, with something like the Mark 14, where you've got both options, what depth you set it at, and therefore which detonator is most likely to activate, is in large part down to the choice of the submarine captain. Now, obviously, things like degaussing, which was mainly done to protect against magnetic mines, would help against magnetic torpedoes as well. Therefore, their utility was somewhat limited as the war went on. As far as defences are concerned, there aren't really that many defences against an under-the-keel explosive. What you can do is, well, basically the same kind of stuff that you build into a ship against grounding and mines. So having a double or triple bottom. And to be honest, for under-keel detonations, that's probably realistically about all you can do. There are a few more esoteric anti-mining measures that were taken in some cases on HMS Belfast, which is why I'm showing the magnetic mine damage on Belfast. That probably actually saved the ship, because being worried about what effect mine damage would have on the ship, they actually moved all the machinery further aft. The actual aim was actually to shorten up the propeller shafts, but as it turned out, that ended up moving some of the boiler rooms far enough aft that when this magnetic mine detonated, and it could have well also been a magnetic torpedo, it flooded a bunch of small compartments, which limited the flooding compared to if that mine had hit in exactly the same place on a standard town class. That would have been the forward boiler rooms being underwater, which would have been a considerably larger problem. As far as specific ships being sunk by the magnetic detonating torpedo as opposed to contact detonations, That's a little bit harder. I'd have to look into that in a bit more detail, because that requires, obviously, not just finding a ship was sunk by a torpedo in the latter stages of the war. It would also require either someone else having done the work already, or me going through the torpedo expenditure records for the submarine that sank it, and hopefully they've noted down what setting the torpedo was at. So unfortunately, unless anyone else knows of a good resource for that, I can't immediately tell you which particular ships were sunk by magnetic detonating torpedoes under the keel and which ones were just hit directly, because unfortunately in most literature they just tend to use the terminology hit, which means torpedo detonated successfully and did damage. Doesn't strictly, obviously, necessarily mean it did physically hit the ship, but that's colloquialisms for you. Randwick78 asks, how do you rate each of the Washington Treaty signatories' first-generation cruisers compared to each other, both as built and as at the most modernised examples of each at the start of 1942? I think the answer definitely changes, because you're looking at the Miyokos, the Counties, and the Pensacolas. All three have both 8-inch guns, or near enough, and torpedo launchers at the start of their careers. Pensacolas have them removed prior to the Second World War. Some of the Counties would later have theirs removed as well. At which point, if you look at speed and overall firepower, then, and to a certain extent even protection, I think in their initial forms, the Miyokos probably edge things out. So the Miyokos and the Pensacola's have 10 guns, the Counties only have 8. Armour-wise, I mean, none of them are particularly brilliant in their original form, but the Counties, with their box protection, have somewhat less than the other two. Turrets are a slightly different matter, but let's not go into that in too much. And, of course, the Miyokos have a fair torpedo armament, and they're also the fastest. So, base form, Miyoko's the best, but then again, that's not very surprising, considering how much they cheat the treaty by compared to the Counties and the Pensacolas. By the time you get to 1942, however, I think things have changed. The Pensacolas are still never going to be the world's best sea boats, so that kind of rules them out of the running of top tier. The Miyokos have been modernised and updated, but not by huge amounts compared to some. The thing is, the Counties at that point, which in their original form you could argue are either similar to the Pensacolas or potentially possibly slightly worse in their original form. By 42, if you're looking at the most updated Counties, so ones with a full-length belt, significantly upgraded anti-aircraft battery, may or may not still have the torpedo launchers, etc. Plus, of course, by that point we'll also have radar. Well, radar alone, apart from anything else, gives them quite an advantage over something like a Miyoko in 42. Obviously, Pensacola and Salt Lake City would have radar as well, but the Counties are better sea boats and are now, for the best of them, comprehensively somewhat better protected. Yes, they have 2 less guns, but broadly speaking, I would say in 42, the best of the upgraded Counties is probably the best of those first-gen ships, with Pensacola and Salt Lake City following and the Miyokos in a distant third. Michael Imbezi asks, I noticed that the Washington Navy Yard flooded roughly hip-deep in October of 1942. When they happened, how much did natural disasters affect the functioning of naval facilities, and how did they recover? I mean, a lot of it varies on what exactly the natural disaster is. So, by the way, here's Washington Navy Yard underwater for those of you who are interested. Now, if it's a flood, most of the time for a Navy Yard, it's a case of, oh no. Anyway, about the worst you're probably going to have to deal with is all the muck and flotsam and jetsam that floods tend to bring with them, but that can be scraped off by a large workforce, and hey, shipyards usually have your large workforces to hand, because places like slipways and dry docks, they're supposed to deal with water anyway, and so are the ships, so pump them out, scrape them off, back into work you go. You can, of course, have some issues if you've got a half-built ship or a ship that's in dry dock that's been majorly cut open when a flood occurs, but those kind of confluences are usually pretty rare. And as long as none of the ships have floated off somewhere you didn't want them to during the flood, you're generally okay. If it's a really, really bad flood and you've flooded the administrative buildings and so forth as well, and workshops, that can be a bit more of a problem. But at least in the time period the channel covers, there's less electronics to destroy, and a bunch of heavy machine tools that get flooded. Again, if you clean them off and give them a few test runs, usually they should be okay. Whereas these days, with loads of electronics being fried, you might be in a lot more trouble. So water, not a world-ending issue. Fire, much more a problem. There tends to be a lot of combustible stuff in navy yards. If fire spreads, obviously, recovery can extend to just completely rebuilding the yard if the government at the time has the money and the wherewithal to do so. Those can be obviously really bad. High winds, unless you're talking catastrophically high winds or tornadoes, which rarely hit navy yards, generally they cope pretty well with that. Ships tend to be rather large and relatively immobile, unless they're being dragged at anchor, which can be a problem. And again, unless you're talking about catastrophically high winds, cranes and so forth will tend to stay pretty much where you want them to be. And hopefully you've designed your buildings well enough as well. But that's a civil engineering problem, not necessarily a navy yard problem. The biggest natural disasters that really can mess with naval facilities are pretty much going to be earthquakes, because you can get things like a Margie falling off of her gantry supports and breaking her back, twisting her hull. Obviously, it can split buildings, it can misalign slipways, open up dry docks. The problem is physically realigning the landscape. That can really stuff with a navy yard, and potentially, if it's really bad, it can make it almost better to start over nearby rather than try and repair stuff, because the single greatest strength of most shipyards tends to be the fact that they are made pretty much of the landscape and about as durable as it, which, fire is going to be a hard place to destroy a dry dock. And as I say, with flooding, you can just pump it out. But when the land itself is rebelling against you, then the very thing that was your strength becomes your weakness. So with natural disasters, it can be anything from, well, that was inconvenient, let's spend a couple of days cleaning up and back to work, all the way through to, well, I guess we're building a new navy yard somewhere else then. Peter Guy asks, I'm curious about anti-aircraft radar in World War II. Was the radar able to pick out individual aircraft as opposed to broad enemy formations approaching the ship? Let's say there was an aircraft carrier with 12 Bofors on one side of the ship and 4 enemy planes are approaching. In modern video games, there would be targeting reticules focused on each aircraft. But was World War II era fire control radar able to direct each gun to fire at a separate aircraft instead of all of them focusing on the lead aircraft and ignoring the other 3 planes? Since radar was in its infancy, I'm wondering how precise the targeting was and whether the fire control computers were able to direct anti-aircraft fire equally amongst multiple targets. So there's actually 2 related issues here, detection and tracking. So detection, in theory, yes, air search radars could detect individual aircraft, but the fidelity at which they could detect them and so forth, that depended quite a lot on both the radar type itself, how precise the radar was generally, and also the kind of receiver scope you were looking at. So if, for example, you have an early air search radar and it's displaying more of the oscilloscope style output, if you have 4 enemy aircraft approaching and they're, say, half a mile apart each, so they're coming in a line, then the radar will almost certainly be able to tell you that there are 4 enemy aircraft approaching, because the spike on the oscilloscope is relative to the distance and the radar return it's getting. So you would learn that, well, the radar return of about this size indicates an aircraft of this scale. A slightly bigger one will be a slightly bigger aircraft, and as the spike gets taller and taller and taller at a given distance, that indicates potentially lots of aircraft at that distance. But if you've got 4 individual aircraft all flying line astern, then if there's enough spacing, you'll get 4 distinct spikes, and you can go, okay, well, none of these spikes is bigger than a single aircraft, but there are 4 of them spaced out over, say, 2 miles. Therefore, we have 4 aircraft coming in at roughly half-mile intervals. Whereas if they're all stacked together in a little diamond formation, that kind of early oscilloscope type return will just send you a return that says, well, that's about the size of 4 aircraft at this approximate range. Obviously, as I say, as radar fidelity improves and as the scopes switch from the oscilloscope profile to PPI type displays, the ones we're more familiar with, then you can start to more specifically see single contacts. So now bearing has something of an issue, because if you had, say, 4 aircraft in a line abreast, and they were a quarter, half-mile apart, you might still just see a general spike at that distance, where on the oscilloscope version, whereas on a PPI scope, you might see 4 individual dots across the bearings. And obviously, what you were detecting and how would depend on what you could then direct your fire control element at using your long-range heavy anti-aircraft guns. But as you come closer in, obviously the radar in that period, without a lot of computer analysis like we have these days, it would generally either be directed at or lock onto a lead aircraft, or perhaps the largest concentration of enemy aircraft. And that's why you have multiple anti-aircraft fire control directors, if you can possibly do so, and why a lot of the lighter anti-aircraft guns, as you get closer, tend to be individually aimed. And then as time advances, you get more and more anti-aircraft fire control radars deployed, so they can lock onto more and more individual targets, until eventually you get to the point at the very end of the Second World War where you'll have things like individual quad Bofors mounts, which will be equipped with their own specific radar, so that radar can lock onto the specific target that that particular mount is aiming at, independent of what any of the other mounts might be aiming at. And obviously how the enemy formation is arranged has something of a say in it as well, because if the enemy's really tightly boxed up, then perhaps even a late war radar is just going to go, well, that's a general blob, shoot at it generally. Whereas if they're relatively spread out, then even a relatively early war radar and fire control system might be able to then engage individual targets and direct guns at separate targets, because it can discern that there are separate targets. Duke Master asks, island nations and countries with overseas colonies tend to be the prime candidates for possessing good navies. What about the Belgian Navy? They did admittedly have only 1 colony, but it was a very large colony given the size of Belgium. Why don't we ever hear about a Belgian Navy? Essentially because for a lot of the time there just wasn't one. I mean, Belgium itself is a relatively recent invention, much as you might think that Belgium was perhaps invented as a tripwire for everybody else to settle their differences in Europe over, but nonetheless, Belgium did actually come into existence as its own thing in the early part of the 1800s, except that in between then and the end of the time period the Channel covers, Belgium has had a navy 3 times, and each time it hasn't really lasted very long. So from the inception of Belgium, for about 25-30 years to the end of the 1850s, beginning of the 1860s, there was a small Belgian navy, half a dozen smallish warships or so. And then the Belgian government decided, actually, as an economy measure, we're just going to abolish the navy, just have essentially a glorified, slightly more heavily armed Coast Guard. And that situation pretty much lasted until the First World War, when, well, the existence of the First World War, the invasion of Belgium, kind of prompted the Belgians to think about maybe having a navy again. They were actually given a reasonable-sized, small contingent of torpedo boats and so forth out of the German Navy at the end of the First World War, but that barely even lasted a decade before, in the 20s, again, as an economy measure, the Navy was scrapped. And then in World War II, well, in the immediate run-up to World War II, suddenly the Belgians again were like, hang on, it's those pesky Germans again, maybe we should have a navy, but they were partway through forming said navy when, oh, well, those pesky Germans invaded. And so off went pretty much the entirety of the Belgian Navy on a single ship over to the UK, where it continued to expand as the Belgian component of the Royal Navy during the Second World War, and then subsequently the Belgians have, post the period that the Channel covers, mostly maintained a small navy, although I believe they now share it with the Dutch. Toreno asks, a while ago I learned about the Luxburg Affair, where in 1917, in a move similar to the Zimmermann telegram, the German charged d'affaires in Argentina sent telegrams to Berlin via Sweden proposing that certain Argentine ships should be sunk without trace, which was intercepted and resulted in great embarrassment for Germany. This seems a rather drastic proposal with a lot of drawbacks for little gain, which made me wonder what sort of cargo from Argentina would have sparked such a statement, and is it even likely that these ships could be sunk in a way that couldn't be traced back to Germany? To be honest, looking through the correspondence in question, which, if you're interested, can be found in the American Journal of International Law, Volume 12, Number 1, from January 1918, pages 135 to 140, which you can look at on JSTOR, my only conclusion is that Luxburg was slightly unhinged and possibly had gone deep down the rabbit hole of believing the absolute most ludicrous of the propaganda that the Germans were putting out during the war. You know, in modern terms, swallowing the Kool-Aid, well, not even swallowing Kool-Aid, having constructed a swimming pool full of said Kool-Aid and then holding himself under with lead weights. Because in the same message, he says of these two small Argentine steamers, the Oran and Guazo, he's saying, well, you know, they're coming near to Bordeaux, which is, of course, French, so enemy territory as far as he's concerned. And he's saying, well, can we spare them if possible? But if not, we'll just sink them completely without a trace, which infers the U-boat surfacing and ensuring that there are no survivors, which, you know, is a war crime. Never mind the fact you'd be sinking ships from a nation that is ostensibly, at least, or was up until that point, friendly to you, which is what the Argentinians were upset about in the first place, the fact that their ships were being sunk, despite being notionally friendly to the Germans. Then, of course, he goes on to just start insulting random Argentine government officials. And then he starts insulting the population of South America generally. And then he starts talking about sending a submarine squadron to South America, you know, because, yeah, clearly the German U-boats have nothing better to do in the middle of 1917 than swan off en masse to South America, which he thinks is then going to be some form of intimidation display to influence the local governments. And then he goes on about their German political aims in South America and reorganizing southern Brazil, and then asking the German government to cultivate a friendship with Chile. Yeah, Chile. The one nation in the whole of South America that in World War I was the closest to being a British ally. They're the ones he wants to try and break away into the German sphere of influence. Yeah, as far as I can tell, in the best possible interpretation, Luxburg appears to have completely ignored the outside goings-on in Europe and just decided that he was going to try and further his particular vision of how South America should bend the knee to Germany, up to and including, you know, requisitioning random numbers of U-boats for show of flag demonstrations in the middle of a global total war. And if you're being slightly less charitable, as I say, he's gone completely off the deep end and is completely unhinged, has no idea really what's going on, doesn't seem to care, and is quite happy to essentially try and organise a 19th century gunboat expedition, but with U-boats, to try and realign the political elements of South America to his favour, despite the fact that in so doing he's almost certainly going to just tick everybody off, and indeed, surprisingly, did tick off the Argentinians to a rather massive degree. And finally, Reichspeer Minister asks, looking at the development of submarines and U-boats from World War I to World War II with the hindsight of today, I do find it difficult to understand why the focus of the boat being fully submerged during a combat patrol wasn't emphasised more. Do you know why? Was it a case of, good enough, or never fully submerge a running system? Basically, because of the limitations of the propulsion plants of the time. Even the best diesel-electric drives meant that you were going to spend a fair bit of time on the surface, and when you were under the water, you weren't going to be going particularly quickly, and not for particularly long, which meant that the bulk of the time a submarine was sailing, it was actually going to be on the surface. So transiting to and from its operational area, most likely going to spend most of its time on the surface. Once it's in its operational area, it can only remain submerged for a limited time, at which point it's going to be spending a good chunk of time on the surface. And because it ideally wants to be submerged as much as possible during the day, that means essentially in the hours of darkness you surface, you recharge your batteries, and you keep them topped up, and you keep fresh air in the sub and all this kind of stuff, and then only really dive when you have to during the day and minimize your power usage. Because again, if you're trying to approach an enemy ship with your submerged speed, you're almost certainly never going to catch it. So a lot of submarine tactics, if they heard or spotted a ship coming in the distance, would aim to run round to an interception position at long range using the sub's relatively low observability on the surface, then submerge and get into the final details of your position and wait for the enemy to arrive. So given that you couldn't stay underwater for all that long at any given stretch, and you would actually spend the vast bulk of your time above water, it made a lot of sense for submarines to then start optimizing for that above water stay to increase their speed and increase their seakeeping and so on and so forth. There were some notable exceptions, like the World War I British R-class, which were more designed for underwater work because they were essentially the world's first hunter-killer submarines, but they were the exceptions rather than the rule. It's only really towards the middle and latter parts of the Second World War when you have submarines that, thanks to new propulsion technologies and more efficient batteries, can actually expect to spend a good portion of their time at sea underwater, that you then start to see design shift over to a better underwater hull form, usually obviously therefore at the expense of their surface capacity. And that's it for this Patreon Drydock. Thank you very much everybody for listening, and if you've gotten to this point, well, congratulations. And I'm only going to mention this maybe once or twice more in various videos towards the end of August, because I really hate talking about this, but I think it has reached a point where it does have to be talked about. So in the past few months, a lot of history-based YouTube channels have taken quite significant hits to their viewership, and therefore all the stuff that entails from that. Mostly, it seems, because of an algorithmic change somewhere in YouTube. Nothing else has really changed about either what those various channels, including this one, have been doing. There haven't been, people blowing up on Discord or social media about these various channels, and Patreon support has generally remained mostly steady. So there's clearly not something catastrophically going wrong either with what those channels, as I say, including this one, have been accused of doing and haven't done, or just generally. It just seems that YouTube's algorithm is either not showing our channels to the regular audience, or is trying to show them to a different audience, or just isn't showing them as much, resulting in an overall dip in views. So, if you'd like to support the channel, and obviously, well, you've watched this far into a 2-part, almost 6-hour Drydock video, so I'm guessing you are. But, if you're not subscribed already, please do so. It might help YouTube decide that it wants to show the videos to more people. And if you want to join Patreon, then, well, there is a link in the video description down below. Both of those obviously help the channel out immensely. As I say, I really, really don't like addressing these kinds of issues, but I think at this point it has to be said. As I mentioned it once or twice in a couple of other videos, and then that'll be all you'll hear from me for hopefully a good few years about the subject.